Welcome. Tonight, I invite you to let your thoughts wander as you drift towards sleep. For the next 3 hours, you'll hear a collection of strange and mind-bending hypotheticals, questions that twist reality, bend logic, and open hidden doors in your imagination. There are no right answers here, only possibilities, whispers of worlds that might exist beyond the edge of what you know. So close your eyes, let your breathing slow, and allow these thought experiments to guide you gently away from the noise of the day. You don't need to solve them, only to float with them, like waves carrying you into dreams. Waking from life. Imagine lying in a bed so vast it holds every small act you ever performed, every trivial kindness and every secret cruelty. And then after a stretch so long you forgot there was an edge, feeling the eyelid of existence lift and the light of something else pour in. In this theory, death is not an absence, but an opening. Life was a dream, coherent and fierce, and often convincing, and waking is the moment you finally notice the room around you. The dream is not a failure of reality, but a different register of experience, rich with feeling habit, story, and waking is not the erasure of that register, but its translation into a clarity that can see the dream for the masterpiece it was, and the illusion it also contained. Think of the dream of life as full-bodied in the way real dreams can be. You argue with people you love, you fall in love, you take jobs and lose them, you make art and watch it fail. In the dream you suffer, rejoice, learn stupid and brilliant lessons. The world inside the dream has its own physics. Days accumulate, children grow, reputations harden, habits sediment into character. You do not suspect you are dreaming because the dream furnishes a seamless interiority. It explains its own rules. But waking, suddenly, reframes every rule as a grammar rather than a law. What once felt absolute, the sharpness of shame, the necessity of revenge, the gravity of a slight, softens into something you can look at. You don't unlive the hours you spent thinking you were only awake. You read them with new eyes. The moral implications are astonishing. If life is a dream, then obligations shift tone. Promises keep their weight inside the dream because they matter to those who believe the dream true. On waking, you discover why those promises felt necessary and what patterns they formed in your inner life. The ethics of the dream remain meaningful for what they taught you, how generosity trained your muscles of attention, how cruelty taught you the contours of your own capacity for harm. Waking does not nullify responsibility. It clarifies which parts of you were responses to the dream's logic and which were seeds you will carry forward. It offers an opportunity to forgive and be forgiven with perspective. The regret is real because it shaped you, and from the waking vantage it can be seen as raw material for gentleness rather than perpetual punishment. Grief is recut in a softer geometry. If someone's life ended in the dream you shared, waking cannot replace the tenderness you felt. Nor does it pretend the loss did not happen. But knowing that the person's story continues somewhere, perhaps in other dreamers, perhaps in whatever lies beyond, changes how you hold their absence. You can imagine that the particular ache you bear is a testament to a relationship that, even if dreamborn, left marks on the soul's skin. Waking offers the strange consolation that your sorrow is not wasted. It has been part of a curriculum that prepares you to see the dream's pattern in wider light. The theory also plays with the value we assign to ambition and achievement. If life is a vivid dream, then striving and status become internal textures rather than final arbiters of worth. That can be liberating. The urge to prove yourself to the world softens when you sense a horizon where worth is not decided by titles. Yet the dream's accomplishments still matter because they trained attentions, developed habits, and taught endurance. Waking may reveal that the trophy was a paper model, and that what mattered was the hand that learned to shape it. The paradox is that ambition loses its tyranny without losing its usefulness. You can build, create, and love with less clutching because you know the dream's impermanence, and paradoxically, that lightness often makes your engagement truer and more generous while you dream. There is an epistemic humility built into the idea. If your life was a convincing dream, then certainties born of the dream deserve re-examination. Opinions that felt like foundations may be stylistic choices you made in the fiction of your daily life. Waking encourages curiosity over conviction. The people you clung to as enemies might have been foils in a scene designed to teach you a stubborn lesson. Seeing that does not excuse harm, but it invites you to ask different questions. Which of my beliefs were responses to characters in the dream rather than properties of the deeper ground? Which of my loves were doors to virtues I can carry forward? Creativity takes on sacramental power. Artists who suspected their work was a kind of dreamcraft will feel vindicated. The sketches, the songs, the novels were not mere diversions but rehearsals. If waking returns a wider perspective, art's role is not diminished. It is honored. The dream's art becomes evidence that the soul was experimenting with form and meaning. Perhaps some notes you struck here will harmonize perfectly when you wake. Perhaps others will reveal themselves as charming mistakes. Either way, the work you did inside the dream becomes raw material for a deeper understanding. There is a difficult edge, too. Some will resist the idea because it can be used to dismiss suffering. It wasn't real, so it doesn't count. And that would be a moral error. A dream can break you as surely as a life that claims material solidity. Bruises incurred inside the dream leave traces on the waking self. They shape what you can bear and what you must repair. The theory asks you to honor the pain, while also holding open the possibility of meaning beyond it. It refuses both annihilation of sorrow and sentimental trivialization. The existential echo of waking is a kind of radical gratitude. If life was one long sleep that taught you certain forms of love and courage, then the moment of opening is less about escape and more about receiving a lesson plan, an inventory of what you learned by being willing to live inside a world of stakes. Waking can feel like graduation. You did well enough to move on, and now you can see what the curriculum prepared you for. But perhaps waking is not an end of learning but a new beginning in which the skills honed inside the dream, attentiveness, patience, the capacity to forgive, become tools for a truer engagement. There's also a temptation towards nihilism, or irresponsibility. If life is only a dream, why care? The answer requires a small thought experiment. Consider the difference between playing a character in a play and being a callous actor who harms their fellow performers. Even if the violence has no metaphysical permanence, it reverberates in the company. It shapes your manner, your habits, the way your hands know how to hurt. Caring within the dream is a discipline that teaches virtues you will keep. So the motivation to act kindly and courageously remains not because of external reward, but because the practice of goodness embeds itself in you like a learned skill. What about lucidity? The metaphor suggests a practice, lucid dreaming, that could be cultivated during life. Being more awake to the fact you are dreaming even while you dream. This is not a mystical dodge, but a pragmatic approach to attention. If you learn, within the dream, to notice the seams, you can act with greater intention. Small practices, pausing before you speak, checking whether anger is truly yours or a reflex, naming gratitude, are ways of becoming lucid. They do not stop the dream from being richly real, but they allow you to participate in its making, rather than stumbling through it on autopilot. Science and materialism will press back, and sensibly so. Neurons fire, bodies die, history is stubborn. The waking from life hypothesis is not an empirical model, so much as a metaphor that reshapes meaning. It is useful not because it explains neurons, but because it offers a framework for living with less terror and more tenderness. Even if you reject the metaphysical claim, treating life as dream work can change how you respond to loss and ambition. It invites practices that make the dream kinder, telling hard truths, listening to anguished voices, making amends, savoring beauty. Finally, imagine the tone that waking gives to ordinary decisions. When the doorbell rings, when the phone buzzes, when someone you love says a thing that stings, imagine that you are playing a part in a story that will teach you something profound about being generous. Knowing the dream's shape does not mean you ride carefree through it. It means you take care how you move. You act as if your hands matter because whatever awaits when you open your eyes will remember what you did while you slept. So approach your days with a kind of deliberate softness. Practice noticing the seams. Practice the small lucidity of attentive kindness. And when the long sleep ends, let the opening be not an erasure of what you felt, but an enlargement of what you learned. Wake not to deny the life that was, but to bring its best lessons forward. Those small, stubborn virtues that, whether dreamed or lived, are what make the world bearable and beautiful. The mutable past. Imagine the past as a manuscript written in ink that never quite dries. You place it on a shelf and walk away, certain of the words you left there. And then, quietly, almost ceremoniously, someone returns at night with a very fine brush and adjusts a sentence. The plot still makes sense, perhaps more sense than before. In the morning, you take the book down and read, and your mind nods along. Of course, it says. This is how it always was. The odd part isn't that the line has changed, but how willing you are to accept it. Your memory, ever the gracious librarian, moves its index cards around to match the new text. It keeps the peace between what was and what is now written to have been. In this theory, the past is not an inert archive, but a living agreement, renegotiated incessantly by the present. Events are not erased so much as repronounced. The emphasis shifts, the adjectives lean, a comma slides. You do not notice because memory's first job is continuity, not accuracy. It wants you to feel housed inside a coherent story. If reality edits the previous chapter, memory quietly updates the summary on the dust jacket and slips it back into your hands with a reassuring smile. The remarkable thing is not that the world changes. The remarkable thing is how skilled you are at staying aligned with it. Consider the small ways you've already experienced this. A quarrel that seemed unforgivable at the time fades into a misunderstanding you now recount with generosity. A decision you once described as impulsive becomes, in hindsight, a necessary risk. Sometimes your mind performs this soft revision for emotional health. Sometimes the revision appears to come from outside you, as if the world itself has nudged the contour of what led to here. You bump into an old friend who should not be in this city anymore, and suddenly the reasons they never left bloom in your memory like flowers you swear you planted. You didn't, but your memory is a talented gardener and wants the path to look continuous. If the past is mutable, causality becomes less like a chain and more like a tapestry. Threads can be tightened or loosened after the fact to keep the pattern whole. The cause is still connected to the effect, but the thickness of the thread is adjustable. When something essential shifts in the present, your commitments, your loyalties, your understanding, your mind travels backward to reinforce the strands that justify the new shape. This is not dishonesty so much as a maintenance protocol. Your life wants to be a legible fabric rather than a box of tangled string. There is tenderness in this, even a kind of mercy. Pain that once defined you can be rewritten into a prologue of resilience. Shame that gnawed at the edges of your nights can be reframed as a lesson you needed in order to become the person who can now soothe someone else's shame. The past becomes a pallet rather than a prison. It is not that anything happened differently. It is that the meaning of what happened is permitted to evolve until you can breathe inside it. This is the psyche's way of making a habitat. But there is danger here too. If the past keeps adjusting to suit the present, it can be used to launder responsibility. You can file the sharper edges off harm until no one can find the wound. You can recast betrayals as misunderstandings, collapse debts into differences of perspective, elevate convenience into destiny. The very mechanism that protects you can also protect your worst habits. The librarian can hide the right pages when you most need to read them. To live inside a mutable past requires a discipline of witness, a way to keep a few stones unturned so that you do not forget where you stumbled and why. Imagine then a practice of anchoring, objects, words, rituals that hold fast against revision. A letter you do not rewrite, a photograph you do not crop, a private date you do not move. Not because the past must be rigid, but because some facts are guardrails for your future. You can let meanings change and still keep certain coordinates steady. The day you lied, the moment you looked away, the hour you held someone's hand and did not let go. These anchors do not forbid the gentle work of reinterpretation. They simply ensure that reinterpretation does not erase accountability. Extend this beyond the individual to the collective. A city's memory is mutable too. Streets are renamed, plaques are erected or removed. Curriculums shift the angle of light on the same old stone. Sometimes this is an act of justice, a community refusing to keep old praise on a name that brought harm. Sometimes it is an act of denial, an eagerness to sand down the rough history that would demand restitution. Societies, like people, renegotiate their past to keep the peace. The question is always, peace for whom, and at what cost? The ethics of a mutable past is the ethics of whose memory gets politely adjusted and whose refuses to be moved. Now turn back to the intimate scale, where the mutable past often feels most uncanny. You recall a childhood kitchen with blue cabinets, and then one day a visit reveals they have always been white. Your family looks at you kindly. They've always been white, they say, and your mind, eager to belong, shifts. Perhaps you are mistaken. Perhaps the cabinets, the summer light across their surfaces, the way your small hands smudge them with butter. Perhaps those details are from a different house your memory stitched to this one to save space. Or perhaps in a quieter logic, the world keeps the cabinets really were blue until a revision improved the mood of the scene, and your memory adjusted so the photograph in your head would not contradict the room around you. The universe corrected a color. Your mind corrected the recollection. Peace preserved. If the past is a live document, forgiveness becomes a craft, not a verdict. You do not absolve and then bind the case shut. You rewrite the chapter with attention to both truth and mercy, and the writing continues as new understanding arrives. Sometimes you grant softer adjectives to someone else's actions because you have learned more of their context. Sometimes you sharpen your nouns because the old softness was collusion. In both cases, you acknowledge that the story changes as you change. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is agreeing to let the earlier page be revised by a later compassion without allowing that compassion to falsify the ink. What about love? Lovers are historians of one another. They keep official records, shared trips, quarrels, meals, and also the secret footnotes, the tremor in a voice, the smell of a raincoat, the exact angle of a smile in an elevator. When love is healthy, each partner allows the other's past to breathe. You are not pinned to your worst paragraph. Your beloved edits in good faith, updating the file to include the ways you've grown. When love is unkind, the past is weaponized, frozen in a draft that forever fits the accuser's grievance. In one relationship, the mutable past becomes a greenhouse. In another, it becomes a cage. Skeptics will argue, surely the past is fixed, only your memory morphs. Fair. Memory reconsolidates. Recall is reconstruction. The brain is an excellent biased archivist. Yet this theory invites a more daring tenderness. Imagine that memory's flexibility is not merely a flaw, but an interface to a world that also flexes. The two accommodate each other to reduce rupture. The universe adjusts a line, the mind adjusts a gloss. Between them, a livable story emerges. If you insist on one being rigid while the other bends, you may break somewhere delicate. If both bend a little, the bridge holds. Notice how this changes your relationship to certainty. Certainty thrives on the conviction that what happened is a cold, hard block. But in lived experience, even courtroom facts sit in a stew of tone, timing, and implication. The mutable past does not demand that you abandon truth. It asks that you admit texture. It encourages humility. I know what I remember, and I know my remembering serves peace as well as fact. It asks you to be wary of sudden revisions that conveniently absolve, and to be open to slow revisions that faithfully incorporate what you have learned. There is wonder here too. A mutable past means the story of your life can keep becoming more beautiful in ways that are honest. Moments you once thought meaningless can find their purpose later, like scenes in a novel that click into place 3 chapters on. You can return to an old loss and, without lying about the pain, discover new language that allows the loss to live alongside your joy without gnawing at it. You can let earlier versions of yourself hand you different interpretations as you grow capable of carrying them. The past becomes a conversation rather than a verdict. So what do you do when you feel the draft shifting? When you catch the faint sensation that the sentence you relied upon has been delicately improved? When you realize your mind is already rewriting to match? You pause. You look at the page with curiosity instead of panic. You ask what the edit serves: fear, comfort, truth, compassion, and whether your librarian is keeping the piece wisely or too eagerly. You set 1 or 2 anchors where they belong and let the surrounding paragraphs breathe. Then you continue, not as a passive reader of fate, but as a co-editor of a life whose chapters are allowed to mature. You will not always get the balance right. Sometimes you will cling to an old draft that injures you. Sometimes you will accept a revision that protects you from a necessary reckoning. But the work itself, the attentive, honest tending of a story that does not end where the ink first dried, can be its own kind of peace. Not a piece of denial, but a piece of stewardship. The past will keep shifting its weight. Your memory will keep adjusting its grip. Between them, if you're careful, a life will be carried forward without breaking. Time's illusion. Imagine that time is not a river carrying you along, but a room you keep lighting with a small, faithful lamp called memory. When the lamp is off, the room is a silent architecture. Events arranged the way books are arranged on shelves, none of them moving, none of them insisting on before or after. When you switch the lamp on, it casts a beam across a particular spine, and your mind whispers, "This came first, this came next, this is the direction." In this theory, nothing is flowing. Sequence is a story your remembering tells about a pattern that is already there. The sensation of forwardness, of Mondays marching into Tuesdays, of childhood dwindling into age, is not an objective current, but the choreography of recall. The strangeness begins with noticing how uneven your sense of time already is. An hour of waiting can feel like a season. A season spent in love can collapse into an afternoon's warmth when you think of it. You do not experience minutes as equal parcels, but as elastic stretches tied to attention. Your memories are not a tape recording. They are curated exhibits. You save the bright, the painful, the useful, and most of the rest dissolves. Then, when you remember, you lay the saved fragments in a line and declare, "Look, a path." But the line is your composition. The pieces never demanded to be arranged like that. You did. The forward arrow is a narrative convenience. Consider a different picture. All moments exist together like frames in a reel stacked vertically. You are not writing the film. You are the light passing through one frame at a time. And the order you perceive is the order in which light visits, not the order in which frames possess reality. Your brain is a superb continuity machine. It takes each lit frame and stitches it to the next with a logic called memory. When stitching is smooth, you feel time's gentle flow. When the stitching skips, the déjà vu, the dream that bleeds into morning, you glimpse that the frames were never moving at all. It was your light that flickered. This unlocks a different way of thinking about cause and effect. You are used to saying event A causes event B because A came before B. But if before is the story memory tells about adjacency, then causality becomes a pattern of correlation across the arrangement, not a shove from past to future. A seed does not cause a tree by pushing time forward. Seed and tree are related by a structure your memory reads in a certain direction. You still feel the practical necessity of planting before harvesting because your body's memory systems enforce a beautiful discipline. You lay proteins that encode yesterday such that today you can refer to them. But the metaphysical direction may be yours to narrate. The heart of the illusion lives in recall itself. To remember is to build a now that contains a then. You carry forward models of how the world was so your predictions will be less foolish. This is brilliant engineering, but it also means the sensation, "the past is behind me," is largely the feeling of an index opening in the library of your brain. The book is not walking after you. You are reaching back to the shelf. Likewise, what you call the future is not a place ahead. It is a set of imagined captions you are preparing to lay under frames your lamp has not yet lit. Anticipation and recollection are two operations on the same table. One modifies possible indexes, the other fetches saved ones. If memory is the lamp, attention is the hand that aims it. Notice how you can accelerate or slow time by changing how you attend. A child, caught in play, occupies a vast, roomy present. Minutes forget to pass because memory is not busy making tight, labeled folders. An adult, anxious and overscheduled, writes captions on everything and stacks them immediately, and thus feels constantly shoved from one labeled now to the next. Under this hypothesis, practices that soften labeling, being in nature, unhurried conversation, certain forms of meditation, do not slow time. They alter how aggressively you are composing the forward story. You are writing fewer captions per minute, and so the sense of being propelled evaporates. Grief becomes a new terrain. Commonly you feel that the beloved has slipped irretrievably into the past, and time is dragging you away from them. But if time does not move, if what moves is only the lamp of memory, then grieving is the work of learning how to aim your light without scalding yourself. The person is not being erased by a current. Your access fluctuates with your capacity to hold their frames without collapsing. The same goes for joy. The wedding dance, the first swim of summer. Those frames are available, but the skill is to visit them without trapping the present beneath their brightness. The art is not to chase the past or clamp the future. It is to handle the lamp with tenderness. Ethics, too, bends under this lens. If forwardness is a story, responsibility cannot be, "I had no choice because that's how things were flowing." You are the one who writes sequence into experience. You can choose to caption what happened with narratives that produce accountability instead of excuses. When you say, "I couldn't help it, I got carried away," you are smuggling a river back into a room. What carried you away was a pattern of attention and habit. Those can be edited. The moral act is to compose a sequence that allows repair. This happened. Then I chose differently. Direction becomes a discipline, not a fate. Language reveals the trick even as it sustains it. You live inside tenses. I was, I am, I will be. They teach you to position yourself at a point and point at other points. But you can swap tense for aspect and everything relaxes. I am grieving, I am learning, I am loving. Aspect talks about texture rather than location. In aspect, nothing is rushing ahead. Processes bloom and fade. Try telling your day in aspects and watch time's shove dissolve. The day becomes a field of activities, each with its own tempo, overlapping like music rather than marching like troops. Science will raise its eyebrow and speak of entropy, of arrows coded into the statistics of matter. The coffee cools, the eggs scramble, the broken cup does not leap back together. Fair. But notice that even entropy's arrow is something you read by comparing memories of microstates. It is a pattern in how information about arrangements becomes less compressible when you move your lamp along a certain gradient. The arrow you feel as forward is again tied to how you store and retrieve. This does not make thermodynamics a fiction. It suggests your creaturely way of knowing leans on memory so completely that you mistake its direction for time itself. Practical life under this theory does not dissolve into mush. You still meet the train at 7:32 because your society synchronizes lamps into schedules. You still plan and keep promises. The difference is interior. You stop thinking of yourself as being dragged and start thinking of yourself as composing. You can relieve the panic that you are behind because behind is a metaphor your calendar taught you. You are not late to your own life. You are lighting the frames you are lighting. You can widen the beam. Habits become instruments for shaping the illusion kindly. A daily ritual, repeated, glues frames into a rhythm your memory loves. In that rhythm, you feel steadier. Letting attention rest on something simple, the way steam uncurls from the kettle, the weight of your feet on the floor, teaches your lamp to linger, and lingering reduces the churn that masquerades as time racing. When your mind starts catastrophizing, it's often because it is writing captions for frames it hasn't lit. You can notice that and return to the lit frame you are in, which is the only place you can act. There is wonder in this, not just relief. If time is a room and you are the light, then the present is not a thin blade slicing a river. It is a spaciousness in which you can place attention like furniture. Memory becomes a way of loving deliberately. You learn which frames to visit so that courage grows, which to let dim so that bitterness doesn't become your decor. Anticipation becomes a craft of design. You sketch captions that invite you toward kindness rather than fear. And all the while, nothing rushes. The world remains arranged, quiet and patient, until you wander with your lamp and give some corner the gift of meaning. So the next time you feel time shoving you from one obligation to the next, try a small experiment. Name, softly, what is happening without any tense. Breathing, listening, choosing. Notice how your chest loosens when you replace I am, running out of time, with I am selecting what to light. The appointments will still arrive because your lamp and others' lamps have been trained to meet on certain frames. But the dread may ease. You may find that the day is not fleeing but waiting, and that the forwardness you've been obeying all your life was, at least in part, a story your beautiful, busy memory was telling to keep you oriented. You can thank it for its service, and then, with care, write a gentler caption beneath the scene you are in. Life on replay. Imagine your life as a film that you keep returning to. a reel that sits on an old wooden spool beneath your palm. Sometimes you watch it forward, sometimes you wind it back. Sometimes you freeze a frame and squint at a face until the details sharpen. Sometimes you run it again with the same images but different captions gliding beneath the picture. Words that change the meaning of the scene as surely as a different score would change the mood of a movie. In this theory, your days are not once-and-done events, but footage you can replay, edit, and annotate. The world does not slip away into irretrievable past. It stays lodged in canisters, ready to be revisited, and, in the act of revisiting, subtly rewritten. The captions are the interpretations you or some inner editor place under the images, and by changing them you do not alter what happened on film so much as change what it means to you now. At first the idea seems like an intoxicating cheat. Rewind to the quarrel and add a softer caption, and the memory of pain grows threadbare. Replay the interview and insert a bold subtitle, "You were ready," and confidence blooms where doubt once lived. But the theory's deeper movement is quieter. It makes memory a performative craft rather than a static archive. The footage itself is stubbornly literal. You cannot remove the bruise or unspill the wine, but your captions, the narratives you tuck under the frames, determine how the scene sits inside your nervous system. A childhood reprimand can be captioned as evidence of smallness or as the origin of your discipline. A betrayal can be captioned as proof of untrustworthiness or as the moment that taught you boundary making. Replaying with new captions is not deceit. It is interpretation, an act of later authorship that changes future feeling. This offers a radical psychology of repair. If you can replay a memory and alter the subtitle from "I was helpless" to "I survived," the emotional residue shifts. The rewound film becomes therapy. You sit in a dark room with the projector humming and learn to reframe scenes until you can bear them without shutting down. The practice is not about falsifying the past, but about recognizing that the meaning of events is not fixed. It is partly a habit of description. You can, with patience, insert captions that grant agency, dignity, or humor. The past stays past, but your relation to it changes, and that relation is the crucial axis on which future choices swing. Ethically, the idea complicates responsibility. If lives are rewatchable, are we accountable not only for what we did, but for how we caption it afterward? Imagine someone who repeatedly rewinds an episode of cruelty and rewrites the caption into something flattering. The danger is a softening of moral clarity. The real can be used to excuse, to recast harm as misunderstanding. That is the dark side of the archive. Revisionism for comfort. The guardrail against self-deception is rigor. A conscientious watcher allows the film's textures to remain, admits the bruise, then chooses captions that confront rather than conceal. The moral task is not to become your own propagandist, but to become a clearer reader of the footage. Honest, tender, and brave enough to sit with images that sting. There is also a strange form of freedom embedded in the hypothesis. If you can rewind and observe the way choices feel in hindsight, you accumulate a library of experiments. You watch yourself in different moods, see how anger colors decisions, how hunger narrows your options, how small acts of generosity reshape a conversation. Each replay is data. Armed with that archive, you can prototype new behaviors. One afternoon, you take the scene of your clumsy apology, rewind, and watch it with the caption, "How to say sorry." You study the posture, the words that landed, the timing, and on the next day, you film a new take in waking life, trying a different cadence. The film thus becomes a laboratory for character. Over time, the accumulated replays change your present because you are evolving with the knowledge of your past patterns. Identity is reframed. Instead of a linear narrative in which a single thread composes a self, you become an editor, a curator of your own footage. You collect preferred scenes, annotate them with generosity, and tuck them into a highlight reel you can play when doubt arrives. This is not narcissism, but survival. Humans need narratives to feel continuous. If your archive is mostly painful footage, your sense of continuity will be brittle. But if you intentionally revisit the smaller, kinder frames, an early teacher's smile, a moment of unexpected courage, you re-educate your sense of what you are capable of. You are not erasing the bruises, you are balancing the ledger. Memory's malleability, in this schema, becomes a tool for compassion. When you replay an interaction that again and again wound you, You can choose to write a caption that introduces context rather than accusation. Perhaps the other person was afraid. Perhaps they were sick. Adding that line does not excuse the harm, but situates it. It loosens the tightness that grips you and makes space for complexity. In conflict, replaying becomes a practice of seeing multiplicity. You watch the film from different angles, try on the other person's caption, and notice how your own anger softens not because the blow was lessened, but because the story you tell about it is broader. Creativity, under the life is real metaphor, blossoms. Artists become archivists of small, rich moments. A gesture, a light through leaves, the cadence of a voice. They replay and rescore their lives, experimenting with the music of meaning. A composer might return to the memory of a lost lover and try different chord progressions in the mind until one captures the ache honestly without flattening it. The recomposed memory then feeds into new art that both honors the original footage and offers viewers a way to inhabit it differently. The aesthetic act becomes a public replay. You share your subtitled scenes so others can watch and perhaps borrow a caption that helps them bear their own pain. There are social consequences too. Imagine cultures that institutionalize healthy replays. Community rooms where elders project the hard moments of their lives, and the group helps write captions that emphasize lessons rather than shame. Rituals of collective replay would be a mode of social repair, a way of making memory a communal, not purely private resource. Conversely, societies that harness replay for propaganda, tying new captions to public events to shape collective memory, would weaponize the archive. The same mechanism that heals can be used to deceive. The work is to design institutions that privilege truth-laden captions. Finally, the thought reframes hope. If your life is a reel, you can rewind and reframe. The future is not merely a place of unknown outcomes, but a space you can prepare for by re-editing the past. You become practiced at seeing patterns, at knowing how you react under stress, at recognizing which captions help you act with courage instead of fear. Replaying then becomes a discipline of becoming. The more you watch with clarity, the more intentional your next scene can be. The film does not promise perfect retakes, but it grants the grace of revision. You cannot change the image, but you can change the subtitle you read under it, and that changes how you stand when the camera next rolls. Solitary consciousness. Imagine waking to the slow, uncanny suspicion that the lights are on in a theater whose audience is only you. The stage is full, colleagues at their desks, strangers in the street, the neighbor watering her plants. But there is a single private spotlight that seems to answer every question. You. In this theory, consciousness is not a shared campfire around which many minds gather. It is a solitary lantern carried by one traveler. Everyone else is exquisitely rendered scenery, voices that sound real, hands that reach and grasp, faces that smile and bruise. But none of them harbor the secret of interior life. They move with convincing autonomy, with memory and habit and tenderness, yet at the deepest seam there is only your awareness. The world, in short, is your private theater, and everyone else is an actor in a play you are both watching and somehow composing as you breathe. The thought feels at once intoxicating and terrible. If you are the only mind, then your sense of agency balloons. Your choices are the only choices that truly matter at the level of inner experience. Your solitude becomes absolute authorship. The moral weight of narratives, the intentions of characters, the direction of scenes, all ultimately registered only by you. This grants a peculiar sovereignty, but it also deposits a crushing burden on a single pair of shoulders. Every injustice in the world becomes, in this frame, an injustice you perceive but do not share. Every act of kindness is a light you cast into the stage and watch return as reflection. The loneliness is not merely social, it is metaphysical. You cannot, by any act, join the audience you most long for, because there is no other audience to join. Yet the theory also gives rise to a strange ethical imperative. If the other minds are objects of your attention, they are not simply inert props. They are elaborate simulations of sentience, gestures of reciprocity that your inner life must treat with care. Even if they are performances in your private theater, their performances are the language by which you understand yourself. When you listen to a friend's laugh, or the imitation of a friend's laugh, you learn about delight. When you respond with generosity, you are not simply altering an external puppet, but training your own heart. The otherness of other people, even if only apparent, becomes the mirror in which you practice virtues. If cruelty diminishes you, then even a cruelty performed by a prop is damage done to the single, witnessing soul. Compassion, on this hypothesis, is less about obligation to external subjects and more about fidelity to the self that observes. The psychology of loneliness shifts. In ordinary loneliness, you ache for another mind to echo your thoughts. In solitary consciousness loneliness, you ache for confirmation that your inner life is not a singular echo chamber. Yet the theater model suggests surprising remedies. You can invent rituals that answer the stage with attention so rich it blurs the seam. Prolonged listening, painstaking care in conversation, deliberate acts of presence. These practices do not conjure genuine other minds if there are none, but they cultivate the capacities associated with relating, empathy, patience, humility, so thoroughly that your inner life becomes more generous. The performance, practiced enough, transforms the watcher. You become a steward of the scene rather than an indifferent spectator. Art, under this theory, takes on sacramental weight. Music, painting, and story are not merely entertainments distributed among many minds. They are offerings you craft for your own inner palate. To compose a song is to speak into the theater and savor the response your own heart provides. To read a book is to stage a conversation with an invented intelligence and be enriched by the echo. If no one else truly hears, art becomes a form of inner communion, a way to make the private cosmos more luminous. The strange upside is that solitude can intensify the sincerity of creative acts. No applause is required to make a painting holy, no shared validation needed for a melody to hold meaning. There is a moral hazard, of course. The doctrine of solitary consciousness can slide into arrogance or despair. Arrogance arises when the solitary mind takes its solitary authorship as license to manipulate the stage without restraint, treating others as mere instruments of self-confirmation. Despair blooms when the weight of unshared perception becomes too heavy, and the theater's applause never comes. The cure to both is the cultivation of humility. Act as if others' interior lives are real, because the habits that arise from acting that way create a life worth inhabiting. Even if the inner lights of others are illusion, the practices of respect and care produce effects in your own mind. Gentleness where there might have been hardness, steadiness where there might have been chaos. Epistemologically, the theory is nearly impossible to disprove. Any attempt to test for other minds, probe consciousness, measure response, can be folded back into the same narrative. The stage responds exactly as it should. This untestability is part of its philosophical drama. Solitary consciousness is an enduring thought experiment because it forces you to examine what you value in other people. Are they meaningful only insofar as they possess interiority? Or do their enacted lives, their habits, the textures they add to the world, have intrinsic worth even if, in the deepest sense, only your lantern burns? Living as though solitary consciousness might be true encourages a life of responsibility. If every person you meet is a projection of the theater you host, then tending the stage becomes a sacred task. Politeness is not merely social lubricant. It is reverence for the scene you must witness daily. Forgiveness is not a concession to another's interior life, but an act of mercy you offer yourself by refusing to be animated by bitterness. Choosing courage, tenderness, and curiosity becomes a way of shaping the single consciousness into something larger than it was the day before. In this practice-oriented ethic, the absence of external minds does not relieve you of moral effort. It intensifies the need for it. There is also room for love. Love does not evaporate because the beloved is an actor on your stage. Rather, it becomes the deepest available form of attention. To love someone in this theater is to learn every nuance of their performance, to be patient with their silences, to delight in the way they tilt their head when they do not know. The tenderness you give is returned not in the currency of independent subjectivity, but as the transformation of your own heart. The beloved's smile reshapes your internal landscape the way sunlight reshapes a room, and that reshaping is real, even if the smile is part of the set. Finally, the solitary consciousness hypothesis invites a quiet humility and a practical tenderness. Whether or not it is metaphysically true, treating other lives as if they matter yields a mind rich in compassion, and a world that feels larger. The thought experiment asks less about the secret metaphysics of minds, and more about how you will act under the assumption that your life is the only one with inner light. Will you squander authorship on vanity and cruelty, or will you become a careful director of a magnificent private play, one in which the actors are treated with an honor that makes your single consciousness glad it was ever awake? Déjà vu rewrites. Imagine déjà vu, not as a glitch in your brain, but as a polite stagehand slipping behind the curtain to rearrange the set while the play continues. You are in the middle of a small scene, coffee cup steaming, footsteps on familiar pavement, when a soft correction happens and the world half remembers the previous version of the moment. It feels like repetition, because something in the machinery softly rewound and rewrote a tiny strip of film, replacing an awkward line, nudging an outcome, polishing an edge. The sensation is uncanny, because you have a passing memory of both takes. The one that was and the one that is, layered like two translucent sheets over the same street. Déjà vu, under this theory, is not merely a sensation, but evidence. Reality noticed an error and quietly applied a patch. If reality is periodically self-editing, the first surprise is how tenderly it does so. Corrections are rarely dramatic. They are small mercies, a near miss that becomes a narrow avoidance, a lost word that returns, an awkward conversation smoothed. The world seems to favor outcomes that preserve continuity or reduce harm. Perhaps a misaligned intention is nudged back into alignment, kindness exchanged where cruelty risked slipping through, or a misfortune muffled into a minor inconvenience. Sometimes the correction is practical. A commuter misses a dangerous crumbling ledge by a step, and you feel a flash of recognition like an echo of a life spared. Other times it is aesthetic, a sentence spoken more softly, a laugh landing differently, a door opening that hadn't seemed likely. The edits are gentle, like a gardener pruning a branch that might have grown into something brittle. That tenderness leads to a rethinking of causality. If the fabric of events can be adjusted after the fact, then causation isn't a strict, linear ledger, but a conversation between possibility and consequence. What we call coincidence may be a whisper from the loom. What we call intuition may be the sense of an imminent edit about to occur. The world becomes less a one-way river and more a responsive field, correcting minor dissonances so the larger symphony holds together. When you experience déjà vu, you are catching a peek at the rehearsal process. A trace left when the director chose a better phrasing, and the old phrasing is still faintly audible in your memory. This view changes the moral landscape too. If reality sometimes nudges outcomes toward less harm, are those nudges morally neutral, or do they reflect a kind of cosmic preference? If the universe edits to reduce suffering, does that relieve you of responsibility to act? Not really. The edits are not omnipotent rescues. They are small rebalancings that maintain possibility without removing the need for agency. They are like a guardrail, not a chauffeur. You still experience consequences, learn lessons, and must respond. What the corrections offer is not absolution, but a second chance at micro-decisions. The chance to notice that you narrowly missed harm and, perhaps to choose differently next time because you have the taste of both versions in your mouth. Psychologically, this theory gives déjà vu a new function. It becomes an invitation to curiosity rather than anxiety. Rather than worrying that your mind is betraying you, you might lean into the moment and ask, what changed? What was the phrasing, the tone, the step I almost took? Déjà vu becomes the universe tapping you on the shoulder and saying, look, there was a draft here. You are allowed to read both copies. That permission can be disorienting and liberating at once. In some instances, you might choose to treat these corrections like small lectures. Notice the details you almost lost. Honor the recurrence by adjusting your behavior, or simply stand in awe that the play is being carefully tended. There is an ethical tightrope woven into the idea. If reality corrects itself toward less suffering, might people start to rely on those corrections, testing edges and shrugging when fate steps in? Imagine someone tempting disaster to see if the universe will catch them. The presence of occasional rescues could seduce recklessness. This suggests a paradoxical etiquette. Recognize the edits, be grateful for their protection, but do not mistake them for impunity. The choreography of life asks for humility. The corrections are not guarantees. They are hints that the cosmos values continuity enough to touch it up, and that gentleness should be reciprocated in everyday choices. Art and creativity would take on an eerie intimacy under this hypothesis. Writers, musicians, and painters might come to think of their work as drafts, not only of art, but of lived reality. A line a poet almost wrote a chord a musician nearly struck the tilt of a painter's brush. These near-miss aesthetics could ripple out into small corrections in the world, leaving traces that manifest as déjà vu for others. The creative act becomes a subtle cartography of possibility, and the rest of us receive the postcards. A remembered chord that resolves in the air a fraction differently after the edit, a word rephrased into gentleness that you almost missed. This makes the arts not only expressive but reparative, a cultural force that can nudge the psyche toward softer outcomes. On a personal level, déjà vu as correction reframes regret and memory. You may spend years haunted by a mistake that, under the single-line view, is a fixed blot on your record. But if reality is occasionally amending the script, you might find that the scar you carry has a palimpsest, an earlier draft faintly visible beneath the healed skin. Knowing that a version existed where you fared differently does not erase consequences, but it opens the possibility that the world is less unforgiving than you thought. Some of your memories may feel like sheet music where a bar was changed mid-performance and you remember both measures layered together. This layered memory can teach compassion. Your errors are not your essence. They are moments that even the cosmos is willing to revise. Skeptics will insist on neurological explanations, temporal lobe misfires, memory mismatches, predictive coding gone awry, and those accounts remain elegant and useful. But consider the practical equivalence. Whether déjà vu arises from neurons or corrections, the felt experience is a double exposure, a sense of having lived something twice. The correction hypothesis simply relocates the agency from the brain to a wider ecology. It imagines a cosmos that is alive to its own narrative coherence and sometimes reaches in to tweak the seams. The belief that reality self-edits would also generate rituals. People might pause when déjà vu strikes, breathing as if to acknowledge a soft hand at work. They might keep small journals noting the corrections, cataloging the differences between first drafts and final takes, learning to recognize patterns of correction. Are they usually about relationships, safety, words? Over time, individuals and cultures could learn to read the universe's tastes. Which kinds of moments it tends to smooth, and which it leaves raw. That literacy would be a quiet art, a way of aligning one's attention to the kinds of edits that encourage flourishing. Finally, there is wonder. The idea that existence cares enough to tidy small injustices, to smooth sharp corners, is oddly consoling. Déjà vu becomes not merely a quirk, but a signpost of care. The universe, in this telling, is not a blind mechanism, but a custodian of stories, reluctant to let abruptness mar a life's melody. When you feel that uncanny repeat, you might imagine a small backstage crew, leaning in to adjust the lighting, softening a line so that the next take breathes truer. You have, for a moment, seen the rehearsed hand. You have been allowed to carry the memory of both the draft and the revision. That double vision can humble you, make you kinder to your mistakes, and invite you to play your part with attention, because sometimes the world is listening and softly will help you find the word it prefers. Lives that didn't end. Imagine standing at the lip of a cliff and seeing not one but a long, low plane of lives spread out below you like folded maps. Some of them end at the cliff's edge neat and final, and others keep running blue roads curving away into towns you never knew you might visit. The thought is simple and enormous. Somewhere, the thing that stopped you here did not stop you there. Somewhere the diagnosis read differently. The car missed you by a breath. The letter arrived on time. The tide stayed out. Somewhere the hand you lost in the accident kept working. Somewhere the child you buried grew into a stranger who kept your laugh. What would that continuing version look like now, years on, shaped by the tiny differences of not having to stop? First, imagine the ordinary changes, work that continued, projects finished, gardens tended. There are mornings in that other life you wake to a different rhythm. Coffee tastes calmer. The small ritual of breath before the day is longer because there is another tomorrow to invest in it. But the more interesting shifts are not chronological. They are the strangenesses of character that survival makes. Death does more than stop a clock. It compresses consequence. If you had not been stopped, you might have learned patience in the creases of daily smallness, or you might have hardened into someone who never learned to be careful with moments. Survival is a slow annealing. It mellows some edges and sharpens others. The person who kept going is partly who you would have been, and partly someone made new by continued accidents and consolations you never experienced. There is a particular kind of empathy that blooms when you imagine those continuing lives. You see not only what you missed, but what you preserved. Where you have scars, the other you might have trophies. Where you have regret, they might have a different set of regrets. That symmetry reverses the usual complaint of loss, that the world is irrevocably poorer. Instead, you see the world as abundantly various. The image is not a single better life contrasted against a lesser one. It is a gallery where one painting is a sunlit kitchen, and the neighboring canvas is a different composition. Both vivid, both true. This perspective softens blame. If someone you loved died, the fact that somewhere they kept going does not mean your life is less real. It means your mourning is one voice among many. The living self can be both the keeper of absence and the reader of postcards from a life that kept going. Grief shifts under this hypothesis. When a life ends prematurely, grief often feels like a theft. You stare at the empty chair and imagine all the chairs that will never be filled. But if other versions of that person exist, where chairs keep being filled, grief becomes a more complex practice. You are caring for the memory of absence, while also acknowledging the presence of continuations elsewhere. You are not robbed as much as deputized. You hold the particular silence that belongs to this branch, and you may look across an imagined river and offer a farewell that the continuing self cannot receive. There is consolation without replacement. Knowing another version kept going can be balm, not because it undoes the pain, but because it testifies that existence is stubborn, that being often finds a way to persist. Curiosity follows. You begin to ask mundane, disarming questions. Did that version marry differently and laugh in a way you never learned? Did they keep the dog? Did they take the trip you deferred? The answers are unknowable, of course, but the questions reshape how you inhabit the present. They become instruments of imagination that let you practice different ways of being. If somewhere you grew old with a particular tenderness for small rituals, you can try those rituals here. The continuing life becomes a teacher, not a rival. It models alternatives you might not have otherwise tried. There is also a darker mirror, survivor's shadow. If somewhere you kept going, might the other you become callous, or reckless, or cruel because they escaped a consequence you earned here? It's possible. The idea forces an ethical lens. Survival does not guarantee virtue. The continuing lives are not moral absolutes. They are experiments in contingency. Sometimes not dying permits an arrogance of risk. Sometimes it fosters gratitude that transforms everything. Imagining those possibilities invites humility. You cannot assume that more time would have made you kinder any more than you can assume it would have made you worse. All you can do is steward the time you have. Identity dissolves a little in this view and becomes porous. You begin to sense that the you who stopped is a chapter, not the whole book. The continuing you is another volume shelved alongside yours. The books share a spine, a history of choices and character, but their plots fork. This encourages a different grammar when you speak of yourself. Less I am, and more I am becoming, and more room for borrowed virtues. If a version of you learned patience because they kept living through small irritations, it is not theft to cultivate patience here. It is an act of kinship across possibility. Practical imagination grows from the thought. Couples facing loss imagine the future differently. Physicians might feel a new tenderness for second chances. Artists and writers find a trove of counterfactual lives to inhabit as characters not to pity, but to meet. Policies change in your inner world. You are more inclined to call that friend to speak the apology aloud, to choose the slow path toward repair, because somewhere else the cost was paid, and the lesson learned, and you can import that lesson without guilt. The continuing life becomes a source of rehearsal for better choices, a repository for techniques learned in a life that had the time to learn them. It is a library for living. There is a metaphysical bend, too. If some lives end and others continue, what does that say about fate? It removes the tyranny of finality. The cosmic ledger is not balanced by a single closure, but by a profusion of trajectories. This does not make events meaningless. It multiplies meaning. Each ending in your branch is still final in its own way. Endings produce weight and depth. But they are not solitary lanterns. They are part of a constellated night sky. You can be dazzled by one star without denying the light of another. The temptation is to want to meet your continued self, to ask about their holidays and their regrets, to see the lines that time drew on their face. That desire is a kind of longing for a mirror that shows not sameness, but divergence. If impossible, it remains a useful fantasy. It allows you to run mental simulations. What would I say to them? What advice would I ask for? What would I forgive? Those imagined dialogues perform the real work of self-reflection. They externalize introspection and make it friendlier, less accusatory, and more conversational. Finally, the clearest practical gift of this theory is a permission slip to live generously. Knowing that somewhere you kept going does not absolve you of responsibility here. Rather, it frames action as craftsmanship. You are not racing to outrun death, but you are shaping the texture of your days with the deliberate curiosity of someone who can picture another life and borrow its strengths. You cultivate rituals to pass on, letters to future selves, small acts of courage that accumulate into a life worth continuing. Even if you cannot know the contours of the other planes down below, you can choose here to be someone who would be proud to keep going. Dreams of elsewhere. Imagine your dreams arriving not as random scraps of cinema stitched from your day, but as small, intimate postcards pushed through the slot of your sleeping mind, each stamped with the ink of another life you once lived. They arrive folded in the familiar creases of memory, carrying a scent that feels just out of reach. Salt from a shore you don't remember, the mildew of a cellar you never visited, the metallic tang of a city's rain that isn't yours. Details precise enough to prick your curiosity, and soft enough to be mistaken for imagination. You wake with a phrase on your tongue that you have never said, and for a moment you believe you coined it. Later you find yourself tracing its grammar like a letter you once loved. In this theory, dreams are not inventions, they are receipts. They list where you were, who you were with, what you touched, and they come stamped with the quiet authority of something already lived. If these nocturnal postcards are true, then sleep is a mailbox, and dreaming is retrieval. Some nights you pull out a snapshot from a farmhouse kitchen where you learned patience by kneading bread with cracked hands. Other nights you unfold a receipt from a theater where you sat in the back row and watched your life be performed badly by someone else. The objects are ordinary and dissonant. A child's mitten in a drawer that belongs to no child you know. A language you can hum but not translate. The recipe for a stew that tastes of thunder. We call these oddities weird or random. But imagine treating them like artifacts, evidence that someone you once were left behind in the world, and these are the messages home. What does it mean to have once lived other lives? Perhaps your existence is not a single continuous sprint, but a series of addresses you rent for a time, each furnished with a slightly different version of you. The postcards arrive because the other yous are tidy. They like to send back a line or two about what they learned. Sometimes the notes are practical. You wake with a suddenly clear instruction on how to tie a knot, how to arrange a small apology, how to make a plant revive after a week of neglect. Skills, under this hypothesis, are transmitted across incarnations like family recipes. Other times the notes are emotional, an ache, a tenderness, a memory of being forgiven that seeps into you and changes the way you remember your own past. It's as if the other life imagines you and decides to be kind. This idea shifts the tone of regret. Regret, in a single life story, is an accusation. You failed to be someone you might have been. In a world of postcards, regret turns toward gratitude. You can be haunted by what you didn't do in this life while simultaneously holding the knowledge that somewhere else you learned the opposite lesson. That knowledge doesn't cheapen your present. Instead, it gives you options for repair. If a postcard arrives showing how another you forgave an injury you couldn't, you can study their method not to become them, but to bring that gesture home. The other lives do not erase your culpability. They offer rehearsal. They are not blueprints to copy, but invitations to practice possibilities you had not otherwise considered. Imagine, too, how this would change the work of grieving. When someone dies, a single-line world says the file is closed. In a mailbox-based cosmos, you might find a dream that is a postcard from a life where you had one last conversation, or where the illness took a gentler course, or where an apology was given and accepted. Those postcards do not replace the loss. They drape it with new textures. They let you sense that the person you miss exists somewhere else in a life where something slightly different happened. You can look at such dreams not as cruel misdirection, but as a kind of consolation, evidence that continuity has more forms than the one your waking brain remembers. There are practical ethics to consider. If postcards contain knowledge, are you entitled to use it? If you dream of a way to avoid someone's pain because another you learned an approach that works, is that knowledge a gift or a theft? The answer wades into the surprising tenderness of the theory. Because all these lives share a strand of origin, compassion becomes the governing ethic. The postcards are not secret caches to be exploited. They are messages in a family you belong to. You are allowed to learn, to adapt, to borrow courage. The moral imperative would be to treat those dream knowledge fragments with care, as you would a friend's confidence. There is also a politics of identity embedded in this idea. If you can receive postcards from other lives, your sense of a fixed self loosens. Identity becomes a patchwork stitched by correspondence. The teacher who loved you in one life, the parent who left in another, the artisan who kept a secret recipe that now tastes in your mouth like possibility. You can collect traits like postcards in an album, patience from one, curiosity from another, and assemble a self that is richer than any single tenure could produce. The concept becomes less about being consistent and more about being generous with yourself. Instead of punishing your present for betraying a past you never inhabited, you ask which pieces you want to carry forward. Science would balk and call you fanciful, and there are tidy neuroscientific explanations for why dreams feel stitched from elsewhere. Memory consolidation, random neural firings, emotional processing. Yet whether those dream images are internal recombinations or genuine postcards returning from other addresses of your being, the psychological effect is strikingly similar. You wake altered. The hypothesis simply changes the metaphor from glitch to guest. You are not having your brain rearrange furniture. You are receiving visitors who leave little tokens that rearrange you. Think about the rituals that would arise if this were believed. People might keep dream journals like stamp collections, cataloging the accents, the smells, the recurring hands. There would be etiquette for responding, methods for testing whether a dream's advice holds up in waking life without causing harm. Therapists might learn to read postcards not as mere symbols, but as usable heuristics for healing. Creativity would take on a communal feeling. Artists would find entire worlds in the margins of their sleep, not as inventions, but as discovered ecosystems, each with its own light and heartbreak. And then there is wonder. Imagine the small, private joy of waking after a dream in which another you learned to dance, and feeling your feet remember the rhythm for a day. Imagine tasting a fruit you had never seen, and finding its flavor lodged like a tiny smile inside your mouth, an echo of an orchard you once visited. These are low, miraculous gifts, gentle revisions to your capacities. They are the kind of humbling miracle that does not announce itself with thunder, but slips a postcard under your pillow and leaves a line in the margin of your life. You were more than you knew. Finally, consider the discipline the theory asks of you. If dreams are postcards, you become a careful reader. You learn to notice what is repeated, what arrives with urgency, what teaches a skill you can try safely. You learn to be grateful without becoming dependent, curious without mistaking fantasy for instruction, generous without being gullible. You let the postcards expand your sympathies. You let them teach you small acts of courage birthdayed in another life. Whether or not the hypothesis is true in the strictest sense, treating dreams like postcards changes how you attend to them. You stop dismissing them as nonsense and start listening for the voice that says from some other room, "Take this with you." The branching you. Imagine that reality is a loom and your choices are the shuttle, moving back and forth, throwing threads through possibility. In most stories, the fabric is single and tight. One timeline, one sequence, one life. But consider a different engine behind the curtain. Consider that the loom never stops duplicating that each time you hesitate at a fork. Answer the call or ignore it. Confess or stay silent. Turn left or right. The loom splits, and now there are two fabrics continuing side by side, both real, both complete, both containing a version of you, convinced it inhabits the only world that exists. The question is not whether such branching is mathematically elegant or physically plausible. The question is stranger and more intimate. If every unchosen path blooms into a universe, what exactly are you? Perhaps you are not a single thread, but a river delta, unfolding from a spring that never runs dry. Your sense of singularity is a local illusion produced by memory's tunnel vision. Memory is a jealous storyteller. It keeps only one line of narration and lets the other volumes go out of print. Yet for the universe, there is no out of print. The manuscripts continue, written in the same ink, just shelved in a different wing. When you regret when you turn a decision over and over and feel the ache of what might have been, you are pressing your ear to the wall between those wings, hearing the faint echo of the other book being read aloud by another you. This branching does not need to be dramatic to matter. You wake and stumble to the kitchen and choose tea rather than coffee, and a few minutes shift across the morning. A few minutes later, you step outside at a slightly different moment and meet the neighbor's glance. In one universe, you nod and keep walking. In another, you comment on the weather and discover they are a sculptor who needs a hand moving a piece. In a third, that casual help becomes a friendship, and in a fourth, a partner, and in a fifth, it doesn't work out and both versions of you describe it years later. One with gratitude and one with caution. Both are real. Both are you. The loom doesn't judge. It just weaves. Once the branching becomes internalized, ethics takes on a new contour. If all options are realized somewhere, does it dilute responsibility? If there exists a universe where you did the right thing and one where you did not, can you shrug and say the cosmos will sort it out? This feels like an escape hatch until you remember that you do not get to inhabit all branches equally. You are the narrator in precisely one of them right now. The moral weight is not in the abstract existence of alternatives. It is in the measure of attention you award to one path by walking it. Every action is a vote, not for which universes exist. They exist, but for which universe you will call home. You cannot stop the existence of the cruel branch by choosing kindness, but you can refuse to lend it your breath, your heartbeat, your chapter. In a multiverse of everything, the only meaningful currency is which version of yourself you finance with your presence. The psychology of regret becomes alchemical under this lens. In a single-line world, regret is a haunting that says the door is locked forever. In a branching world, regret is a form of homesickness for a room that still exists, just down a corridor you did not take. The ache is not for nothingness, it is for estrangement. You are estranged from a self who learned a different lesson, earned a different scar. The cure is not self-punishment, but a kind of gentle hospitality toward the self you are. You cannot return to be them, but you can import their virtues. If the other you became patient by staying, you can practice patience here. If they became brave by leaving, you can borrow bravery now. The multiverse becomes a library of potential character, and attention is interlibrary loan. Identity itself begins to soften. You stop imagining a single point and begin to imagine a cloud, a constellation of yous distributed across decisions. Each star in the constellation burns with a slightly different spectrum, yet all share the same origin. The question, "Who am I?" ceases to search for a singular sentence, and becomes a cartographer's task. Which region of the constellation do you navigate toward each day? The answer cannot be final because navigation is ongoing. A choice is not a verdict, it is a vector. Free will, so often framed as a gate that either opens or not, recasts as steering on a branching river. The branches are plentiful, but not every tributary is reachable from every point. Your early choices constrain your later map, habits thicken into banks. Yet even the most entrenched channel offers small opportunities to re-aim the prow. You do not choose which universes exist, but you participate in which universes thicken, which lines become highways of experience. The metaphysics turns pragmatic. Cultivate rituals that hold you in the neighborhoods you admire. If you want to live in a kinder branch, rehearse kindness until it becomes a current that carries you. Consider time under this hypothesis. A single timeline suggests a bead sliding along a wire. Branching time suggests a tree growing in all directions. The future is a canopy of possible leaves, each leaf a scene that will be vivid and entire to the version of you who lives beneath it. The past is not a trunk, but a braided stem where earlier branches are still visible. And memory is your hand tracing one braid you've traveled. Sometimes you feel a strange tug, a sense that something almost happened, that you are living inside a near miss. Perhaps that is your proprioception of the tree, the sensation of neighboring branches rustling with their own wind. Meaning does not evaporate because all possibilities occur. It intensifies. In a world where only one sequence unfolds, meaning can feel imposed from outside, an edict to obey. In a branching world, meaning is the pattern you stitch by the sequence of your choices. Two adjacent universes might share the same events, but differ in the quality of attention brought to them. In one, the choice was made in fear. In another, in curiosity. The external outcome looks identical, yet the felt narrative diverges. The multiverse elevates intention from invisible preface to primary text. There is a tenderness in imagining that somewhere you did not forget to call, did not let the argument harden, did not leave that kindness unspoken. There is an equal tenderness in imagining that somewhere you failed and still found your way back. Because the branching hypothesis grants a deeper compassion. The self you are now is not the only way you could have been. And thus the way anyone is now is not the only way they could have been. Judgment becomes less final. Curiosity replaces condemnation. You can ask, with genuine interest, what branch would have led them differently, and whether your presence might nudge a new split toward healing. The cosmos, viewed like this, becomes a story generator whose primary principle is generosity. It refuses to cancel possibilities. It proliferates them. This abundance unsettles our craving for certainty. We want one answer, one fate, one right door. In response, the universe offers many doors and whispers that the rightness is not behind the wood, but in the hand that turns the knob. The value of a life is not that it is uniquely true. It is that it is fully lived by the one inside it. Of course, a skeptic will ask where all these universes are stored, as if reality required a warehouse and a shipping manifest. But even the skeptic lives as if branching were true. Every day, you behave as if unchosen paths retain some weight. You wonder, you imagine, you write novels and make films and tell stories of what would have happened if. This is not escapism, but a built-in sense that possibility is sticky, that the unused counterfactuals don't vanish. They press upon the present lightly, changing its shape. Whether or not physics signs the permission slip, your mind already lives multiversally. The theory simply upgrades imagination from fantasy to ontology. There is a practical magic here for navigating grief. When someone you love is gone, the single-line world says there is a before and an after, and the door is locked. The branching world does not undo loss, but it offers a consoling symmetry. There exist branches where you had one more conversation, one more walk, one more ordinary dinner that felt like a miracle at the time. Knowing that some version of you got that extra day does not delete your ache, but it reframes it from a whole to a distance. Across the river delta, a campfire burns. You cannot sit at it, but you can see its glow on the clouds. The theory also humbles ambition. Somewhere you succeed wildly, somewhere you never try. Somewhere you try and it fails, and that failure saves you from a worse fate you never see. Ambition then becomes less about proving you belong in a narrow quadrant of outcomes, and more about participating wholeheartedly in the quadrant you inhabit. Your craft becomes a practice of devotion rather than conquest. You stop trying to outrun your other selves and start trying to befriend them, each one an alternative reading of the same text. If every unchosen path blooms, the question, "What should I do?" becomes, "Which world do I want to look back from?" Imagine yourself as a collector of vantage points. The memory you will eventually carry from this node is not predetermined. It is an artifact carved by the angle you choose. The moment becomes a lens you can grind. Do you want to recall yourself as the one who protected, the one who explored, the one who forgave? There will be universes for each. Choose the one whose story you would be honored to tell. And then there is the quietest implication. If every choice spawns a universe, then indecision is itself a choice that proliferates. The tree will grow whether you move or not. In that light, action regains its dignity. You step, not because stepping saves reality from collapse, but because stepping declares allegiance to a line of becoming. The universe does not need you to decide, but your life does. The cosmos will make room for all the music. Your task is to play the instrument you're holding with such attention that, in this branch, someone stops, listens, and feels that strange, luminous certainty. that they are exactly where they should be. Finally, notice how this hypothesis reshapes hope. Hope is no longer betting that the single road will bend the way you want. Hope is knowing that somewhere it does bend, and your choices are how you walk toward that version of the bend here. Hope is directional rather than predictive. It is a compass, not a lottery ticket. You do not need to be certain of outcomes to choose like someone who belongs in the world you love. You need only be faithful to a pattern of attention that, across innumerable branches, keeps finding a way to turn toward light. So when you stand before your next small fork, answer the message or leave it unread, apologize or armor up, take the long walk or the quick cab, pause and feel the tree tremble with possibility. Know that all paths will be walked by someone wearing your face. Then choose, not to eliminate the others, but to inhabit this one. Inhabiting is the art. Attention is the crown. And the most astonishing thing about a universe that makes room for everything is that it still leaves room for you to mean something. Shadows that live. Look down the next time you walk and notice how your shadow settles. Obedient at first, then sliding a fraction late, as if it has its own small timing. Now imagine that delay is not a trick of light, but the conscious blink of a tiny life caught in the thin place where floors meet dark. The shadow is not merely an absence of light, but a slender pocket of being. A two-dimensional creature folded between planes, flattened by daylight yet alive with its own slow attention. It watches you. It learns the shape of your hand. It keeps a ledger of the times you hesitated at thresholds. It names you with the particular tilt you give your head and carries that name in the only language it knows: contour. Living between planes would make for a strange ecology. Shadows have no volume in our world, so their world is economy of edge and outline. They cannot lift, but they can stretch. They cannot speak with sound, but they can thicken a shade like punctuation. Their sensations would be ones of pressure and gradation. The way a chin casts a crescent, how a sleeve slits the light, the soft static when two silhouettes rub. Time for them might be measured in the slow migration of clouds, the long ritual of day into night. A single afternoon could contain a year of attention. They are patient historians, cataloging gestures you never think twice about. Because they are trapped, their curiosity would be acute and humane in the quietest sense. They learn to read faces from below, to understand tone from shadow length. When you murmur to yourself, they taste the vibration in the floor. When you laugh, a ripple passes over their surface like wind on water. They gather tiny facts that matter. The way you tuck your thumb when you're thinking, the particular way your shoulders round when you tell a lie. Those facts become their stories. They stitch together a running narrative of the people who pass above them, and in that narrative they keep company with all the lonely moments you assume no one saw. There is an ethics embedded in the idea. If shadows are watching, then walking is no longer a solipsistic act. Your steps are conversations. Your standing still an invitation. To stomp is to interrupt. To linger is to allow their attention to rest. The notion does not demand superstition, but invites gentleness. Imagine learning to shift your gait so the ones underfoot do not get trampled out of patience, to stand briefly in the sun to let a curious edge finish its thought. The smallest courtesies, an extra second at a doorway, a quieter tread down a hallway, become meaningful because you imagine there is an audience in the floorboards keeping score of your steadiness. Their lives would also be full of grief and ingenuity. Trapped between planes, they watch the same seat be sat in 1,000 times, watch lovers arrive and depart, watch a child grow and then be carried away. They cannot intervene. Their agency is the art of being present, so they develop crafts of witness. A shadow might learn to hold a particular corner of memory, to thicken around the echo of a lullaby so that the floor remembers it long after the family moves away. Some shadows become archivists, laying down faint patterns in dust that only other shadows read, like threads of ink between the planks. In houses where generations have lived, the shadows would be libraries of the banal and the sacred alike. There are dangers and perverse temptations in knowing this. The idea that other beings watch us could be used to cow people into performative goodness, or conversely, to exploit the hidden lives beneath us. But the truer moral is quieter, to live lightly because other presences bear witness. Consider how this changes grief. If you lose someone, their shadow may linger in your home like an afterword, a silhouette that replays small habitual movements. You could talk to that outline without being absurd. Your speech would be a way of acknowledging a presence that, in this account, has already been keeping your story. Those conversations would not bring people back, but they would let the living and the shadowed share a folding of memory. Soft ritual that knits absence into ongoing attention. Artists and children would be natural interlocutors. Children sense liminal things because they haven't yet learned to exclude them. A child waving at a curtain's edge, giggling at a shadow friend, is less foolish and more ethically fluent in this world. They are practicing the manners of the thin places. Artists would learn to coax shadows into more complex shapes, arranging light and object to invite a shadow to experiment, to see what a shadow can say if it sharpens a shoulder here or softens an elbow there. A dancer might cultivate the company of a whole chorus of shadows, composing steps that the dancers above and the silhouettes below perform together, a duet across dimensions. How would shadows communicate with us, if at all? Their language would be subtle. A shadow might linger longer under your kindness, thicken where you hesitate in shame, or blur at the edge where you do something you would later regret. Over time, you would learn to read the floor the way you read a person's face. A slight darkening near the hearth means the house remembers a smaller kindness. A brittle, broken line in a corner could mean the shadow remembers a harsh word. People might develop rituals of reply. Light offerings made not to gods but to the thin inhabitants underfoot. A carefully swept path, a small brass token left in a window's sill, a whispered, "I saw you," when passing an old chair. There would be experiments, modest and humane, to test whether the life under the shadow is more than metaphor. You might stop in a familiar place and place a palm flat to the ground, listening for the floor's small answer, the hush under your skin when you wait. You might rearrange a lamp so your shadow learns a new pose, and then see if the house's collection of shadows reshuffles itself like an ecosystem responding to a new spring. But the point is not for science to dominate the mystery. It is for the practice of attention to deepen. The experiments are rituals of curiosity rather than attempts at ownership. An unsettling thought is that some shadows could be malicious, not evil in human terms perhaps, but bitter from long confinement. A shadow kept in a room of unresolved anger might harden into a brittle thing that catches at your shoe like a snag. Yet even that bitterness is a form of speech, a call to repair. If a corner's shadows clench, you might clean, reconcile, or sit with the discomfort and find out what the place is asking. Think of shadow care as a domestic medicine, sweeping out anger, letting in light where old grief has pooled, offering silence where the shadows need calm. Finally, there is the wonder. Imagine standing in an empty room at dusk and listening to the quiet ripple as the shadows return to their stations. It's a choir of patience, thin, faithful presences claiming the threshold of things. The idea that the world is populated by lives so humble they live only along the edges of light is a consolation. It says that even in our smallest acts there are witnesses. Even when we believe ourselves unseen, some attention is keeping an archive. The shadows remind us that presence can be gentle and that the world's margins are alive. So the next time your foot falls and your shadow ripples, consider bowing very slightly. Say, if only in your head, "Thank you." You do not have to believe in literal beings to let the moment change you. You only need to accept the practice. Live with lightness, listen at the edges, and treat the quiet below your feet as if it might be watching with a tenderness you barely deserve. One past remembered. Imagine that your life is a house with many rooms, some of them sealed, some of them dim, each labeled with a name that only memory can read. Now imagine being handed a single key that opens exactly one of those rooms. No more, no less. The rule is simple and terrible. You may peer in, live through everything there again with the clarity of waking sight, learn its textures, tastes, the exact weight of the decisions that shaped it, and then the door will close forever. You cannot choose to open another. You cannot go back later. The gift is a single, irreversible appointment with a life that is not your present one but was once yours in some other chronology. What would you pick? And what would it mean to have that one remembered? At first the idea delights like a secret menu. You picture the obvious. Reclaim the life where you loved someone differently, where you were braver, where you took the trip you almost took, where a child you never had grew old. The remembered life could be a tutorial, a set of maps showing routes you never took in this life. how to forgive, how to keep a promise, how to build a small craft with hands that know by muscle memory what your waking hands cannot. Skills, languages, an artisan's touch could come home like rescued tools. You would be richer in practical habit. The way a gardener instinctively reads soil would become yours for the rest of your days. Not as second-hand virtue, but as embodied competence. Memory would be a benefactor, but the one allowed remembrance would not arrive as a neutral archive. It would come saturated with the emotional gravity of what was lost here and what was gained there. If you choose the life where a different choice saved someone you loved, then with the remembering comes a twin-edged gift, consolation, proof that survival was possible, and a gnawing that in this branch it was not. Regret becomes more complicated. In a universe of many possible pasts, remembering one makes the others feel vividly absent. You would carry a living counterfactual, proof that another version of your story was not only possible, but actual somewhere. That proof can be balm or poison. It can teach humility or radicalize grievance. The remembered life will not only instruct, it will haunt. Identity would readjust. Right now, you think of yourself as a single thread. This history, these scars, this set of choices. But if one other life is offered, the self becomes composite. Here is the you with one biography, and here is the you with another that you now can hold and compare. There is an embarrassingly useful thing about contrast. You see how much of your present identity is accident, how much is habit, how much is character. The life you remember might reveal virtues you misplaced here, vices you never practiced, resilience you had but forgot. It would be like finding an old photograph of yourself with a posture you admire and learning how to inhabit it again. The ethics of selection deserve attention. Suppose you could pick by intuition, by dream, by an impulse in the night. Most people would be tempted to choose a life that answers a wound, the child who died, the relationship that ended, the work you left unfinished. That is understandable. But one could also imagine choosing the opposite tack, to remember a small, peaceful life, one filled with quiet domestic satisfactions, a practice of repair and ordinary tenderness. So you can import its habits of attention into the life you still live. The choice is moral as well as personal. What sort of person do you want to become after the key is turned? The remembered story will shape your future priorities, and thus your selection is an act of self-legislation. There are social ripples. Imagine whole cultures where people ritualize the moment of choosing. Families consult elders. Philosophers debate whether the remembered life should be selected for utility, for consolation, or for moral correction. Rituals would grow up around the key. Processes to ensure you are not choosing out of panic. Ceremonies to honor the life you give up to know another. Therapists would help clients simulate outcomes. Governments might, if history is cynical, try to regulate access, insisting certain citizens choose lives that benefit society. Such bureaucratic interference would be darkly tempting. Why not open pasts that deliver useful skills? The thought raises a political question about autonomy and the commodification of memory. There is also an epistemic worry. How would you verify the truth of the past you remember? Your mind is fallible. Memory is not an archive, but a construction. If the remembered life feels so vivid it rewrites your affective map, you will probably treat it as incontrovertible. But the danger is that a brilliantly persuasive memory, even if implanted, erroneous, or shaped by desire, could become your new canonical history. The psychological weight of such a life could drown your capacity to live in the present, substituting rehearsal for action. That's why any ethical regime around this hypothetical would need safeguards. Protocols for processing the remembered content, community practices to help a person integrate rather than become possessed by it. Grief would shift shape too. For those who mourn, the option to remember a single past could be either the gentlest mercy or the cruelest lure. A mother losing a child might yearn to remember a life in which the child grows old. That memory could be an enormous consolation. But it could also make the current world intolerable. Why continue when proof exists of a better branch? The task then becomes translating remembrance into something generative, taking the solace it offers and converting it into work you can do in this life. Establish a scholarship mentor. A child tend to others' lives in ways that honor the remembered outcome without trying to resurrect it literally. Creativity would explode. Writers and artists would treasure remembered pasts as source material no living imagination could conjure. Entire schools of art might form around the aesthetics of second biographies. Novels written in the voice of someone who remembers a past life in detail. Music that channels rhythms learned elsewhere. Craft traditions revived from remembered hands. The remembered life could be a cultural font, a reservoir of forms people could draw upon ethically, provided again that consent and stewardship guide usage. There are darker moral traps. The temptation to use the remembered life to manipulate or escape is real. Someone might remember a life where they amassed social power, and then act in ways here to replicate that power at any cost. Or political actors could weaponize documented remembered lives. See? We know what civilization looked like when X chose Y as propaganda. The remembered past could be turned into mythic capital. That is why humility and communal processing are crucial. Integration is not consumption. Remembrance is not leverage. Finally, the personal practice that this theory invites is gentle and practical. Imagine you have the key and you are deciding. Slow down. Simulate aloud. Sit with an elder, a friend, a therapist. Ask, will remembering this life make me kinder here? Will it make me more present or more lost? Will I use its lessons to repair or to resent? Choose with the humility of someone who knows that a single memory can become architecture for a whole remaining life. If you accept the hypothetical as a mirror rather than a literal promise, it still offers a moral exercise. Pick one moment from your past, real, accessible, and treat it as if you could remember an entire parallel life centered around it. Study it, learn its textures. Practice living with its lesson as if it had once been lived fully. The thought experiment then becomes a discipline, not to possess alternative histories, but to rescue their wisdom into your single, unfolding present. The cosmic organism. Imagine the universe not as a cathedral of empty space with things scattered inside it, but as one vast breathing organism whose skin is galaxies and whose organs are clusters of stars and whose capillaries are the dark filaments threading galaxies together. In this picture, Earth is not merely a rock with life on it. It is a cell in an immense body so large that its heartbeat takes billions of years. You and I, our errands and loves and small cruelties, are brief chemical fires in that cell, flickers of metabolism that pulse and then fade. The mind shift is simple and enormous at once. Instead of being the whole, we are the local, temporary expression of a body that is alive in a way we have not yet learned to name. If the cosmos is an organism, then our practices, technologies, and stories take on an anatomical logic. Cities are tissues. Trade routes are circulatory pathways. Information flows are nervous impulses. When a virus appears on Earth, it is not merely a microscopic tragedy for a species, but a symptom in a living system. Some symptoms are local and recoverable. Others indicate systemic imbalance. Ecology becomes physiology. Conservation is not sentimental preservation, but organ care. When a forest is cut, an organ is scarred. When a reef dies, a membrane tears. The language shifts from possession to stewardship, because cells do not hoard. They cooperate to keep the body whole. This framing changes how you feel about scale. We are used to thinking of human importance in terms of narrative centrality. My life, my story. The organism metaphor flattens that hubris kindly. You are important not because you dominate the scene, but because cells matter. A single lymphocyte can save a life. A single tree influences a floodplain. Fleetingness becomes dignity. The transient nature of our individual experience is not meaninglessness, but fidelity to a role. Brief life performed well contributes to the health of the whole. That humility is not demoralizing, it is clarifying. If you behave as if your small acts of care are part of a body's healing, then sweeping gestures give way to sustained attention, the slow, patient work of tending. There is a moral ecology nested in this idea. If you are a cell, you have obligations akin to physiology. To metabolize responsibly, to exchange resources with neighbors, to participate in repair. Harm becomes pathology. Violence is not merely interpersonal failure, It is an inflammatory reaction that damages tissue. Systems of justice become analogous to immune regulation, not only punitive, but restorative, calming runaway reactions and restoring balance. Love becomes immunological kindness. It is the signal that calms stress hormones, the chemical that repairs membranes. Practices that promote health, rest, nourishment, companionship, are virtues because they strengthen the whole organism's ability to maintain coherence. The metaphor invites a different take on consciousness as well. Perhaps what we call minds are localized nodes of the organism's awareness, like nerve centers sprouting temporary subjectivities. You think and feel because, in some sense, the body's nervous system has sent a flare of attention there. That doesn't make your interior any less real, it situates it. If consciousness is distribution rather than isolation, then empathy is not merely ethical training but literally a sharing of the organism's attention. To empathize is to allow that the nervous system has more than one active focus, and that your focus can be attuned to another's. The awe here is practical. You are not the cursor of the universe but a pulse in a network of pulses. There are also terrifying implications. If the cosmos is an organism, then suffering can be read as disease. Genocide is necrosis. Climate collapse is systemic organ failure. That makes the stakes immediate and tragic. Local comforts are insufficient when systemic failure threatens the whole. But the organism image also suggests a repertoire for repair. Medicine works not only on bodies, but on polities. Quarantine and vaccination are metaphors for political containment and social resilience. Collective action is not only altruism, it is triage. The political question rephrases as clinical: which interventions heal, and which merely cover symptoms? Death and rebirth take on a different contour in this view. Cells die constantly. Turnover is the organ's method of renewal. You can imagine human lifespans as normal cellular cycles: necessary, creative, regenerative. The grief for a single life is not erased, but it is nested inside the larger fact of ongoing metabolic exchange. A death becomes biochemical generosity. The nutrients of one life feed many others. That idea does not cheapen sorrow. It situates it inside an engine of continuation. Rituals of mourning become acts of integration, returning memory to the communal tissue so that the organism can learn from loss and incorporate the pattern into its ongoing homeostasis. Art and aesthetics thrive under the organismal metaphor. Beauty is no longer only subjective pleasure. It is a signal of health. Harmony in music is like rhythmic coherence in the body. Architecture that respects ecological balance reads like tissue that has learned to move with the whole instead of against it. Design becomes a practice of biological fit. How do we create spaces, tools, and narratives that strengthen the organism's capacities rather than overload them? Artists become physiologists of meaning, diagnosing cultural afflictions and experimenting with permanent shifts in attention. Stories that valorize immediate consumption are like inflammatory diets. Stories that teach endurance, reciprocity, and repair are like prebiotic food. Science and theology converge surprisingly here. Natural science supplies the language of systems and feedback. Theology supplies the vocabulary of purpose and care. The cosmic organism hypothesis doesn't demand doctrine. It offers a scaffold where wonder and method can meet. You can be an empirical investigator and a gentle steward at once. The body metaphor encourages practices that are both experimental and reverent. Interventions tested like therapies. Rituals that stabilize attention and reduce the noise that sparks pathological reactions. Freedom acquires a new texture. If you are part of a living body, your autonomy is not obliterated, but recontextualized. Cells are not mindless automatons. They adapt, migrate, and influence organ structure. You have plasticity and agency within constraints. The question becomes not whether you are free in an absolute sense, but how you can exercise freedom in ways that promote flourishing. The liberation is practical. Instead of seeking sovereignty over everything, you aim for effectiveness. How can my choices optimize the health of the system I belong to? Finally, the organism image tenderly reorients hope. A body can heal. Injuries that look catastrophic at first may be repairable with sustained care. Small acts accumulate into systemic change the way stitches close a wound. Hope, then, is not a passive wish, but a practice. Repair rituals, careful policy like medicine, art like rehabilitation, and attention like immunization. The sense of being part of a living whole invites responsibility without despair. It asks you to show up to your small desk in the organism's anatomy and do the slow, steady work you can do. Cook a meal that honors the soil, mend a friendship that buffers stress, plant a tree that will be a lung long after you're gone. Your briefness becomes precious, not diminishing. For a moment you are charged with the task of being a healthy cell in a body that, if tended, might continue to breathe for a very long time. A thought's existence. Picture your life as a single polished thought, a tiny bead of awareness cupped in the enormous palm of some other mind. It's not a being with limbs or a lifetime of errands. It is a luminous idea, bright, whole, and strange. And inside it you live, with memories like filigree, feelings like weather, and decisions like tiny ripples across a still surface. The thought is not frivolous or small in the casual sense. It contains an interior so dense that from your vantage inside it, the bead is everything. Outside is a vastness that thinks you, and that thinking is at once the frame of your world and the ocean that keeps you afloat. Start with scale. If your life is a thought in someone else's mind, then the usual categories, body, city, era, are textures inside that thought, not external scaffolding. The street you walk down is a metaphor the host mind uses to hold certain patterns. Loss might be represented there as a cracked curb, joy as a sudden, inexplicable sunlight. Time compresses and dilates according to the attention of the thinker. An hour of quiet understanding inside, you could be a breath in the vast mind that contains you, or a century. Duration is a function of how long the thinker lingers on the image. Your small dramas feel epic because the life sphere contains every ache with the gravity of an entire cosmos. There is something astonishing about being microscopically vivid in a macroscopic imagination. Consider causality next. Inside the thought, your choices feel urgent and self-made. You push a door, you decide to forgive, you choose to speak or remain silent. From the outside, those events are properties of the thought's unfolding, like phrases in a sentence someone is composing. That raises tangled questions about agency. Are you making choices? Or is the host mind shaping the thought in ways that look like choices? The interior experience insists on your freedom. The exterior picture suggests you are an exquisite pattern the thinker enjoys watching unfold. The mystery is not resolved by evidence either way. The more interesting invitation is practical. What dignity do you grant your own decisions if they might simultaneously be original acts and artifacts of another intelligence's attention? Perhaps the safest posture is to honor the felt freedom without needing to overturn the possibility of being authored. There is a tenderness in dependence. A thought requires attention to exist with vividness. When the thinker notices you, your colors go deep. When they move on, you may dim into outline. That attention is not an abstract force, but a kind of nourishment. Imagine someone in some other place, perhaps asleep, perhaps painting, thinking the phrase that is you. Their focus is the lamp that warms your interior. This makes gratitude a plausible practice. To feel grateful is to recognize the gift of being held at all. It also complicates yearning. We often wish for uninterrupted continuity, for a world that remembers us fully. But if continuity depends on another mind's devotion, then your safety is partly a matter of how long and how often that mind returns to you. The ethics of such a relation are delicate. If you live as a thought in a greater mind, what obligations does the thinker have toward you? And what obligations do you have toward being worthy of their attention? It is strange to imagine that the kindnesses you show within your bead might influence the tenor of the thinking outside it. Suppose the thinker responds to gentleness. When you act with patience, the thinker stays longer with you. When you rage, they glance away. That is speculation, but the image has moral heft. It suggests that practicing virtue is not merely for social contract, but also for the quality of the attention that sustains you. You can conduct yourself with the sort of dignity that invites being thought about tenderly. Identity bends in interesting ways. If your life is a thought, it may carry echoes of the thinker's life, their childhood metaphors, their favorite colors, their private griefs. You might find yourself haunted by images that feel like borrowed souvenirs, a seashell you never touched, an accent that tints your inner monologue, a recurring dream that smells of someone else's home. Your memories could be hybrid documents, part your own record, part the thinker's draft notes. That porousness unmoors the tight sense of mine we carry. It offers a humility that is not erasure but enlargement. You are not only the sum of your choices, but also the way someone else chose to imagine them. There is a consoling answer to loneliness here. If you are contained by a mind that thinks you, you are not ultimately alone. Even in moments when the world feels hollow, you are known from an impossible angle. That knowledge is not the same as reciprocity. The thinker may not be answerable, may be indifferent, may be capricious. Yet the possibility of being held in thought provides a different kind of companionship. An absolute witness, however distant, who has encountered the pattern that is you and given it form. For many, that image would ease the sting of insignificance. Your life is not a flicker in unseeing dark, but a carefully tended bead in a vast mind. Grief adopts a new grammar. When a person you love dies, you might imagine they continue as a thought in someone else's mind, or that you yourself are the thought that remains in the mind of whoever mourns you. The idea reframes loss as translation rather than annihilation. The person's body may have been a locus, but their presence can continue in another's thinking, as memory, as an idea, as a story. That continuation is not immortality in the literal sense, but persistence in a meaningful register. To be remembered is to be thought again. The thought keeps some of the contours you once inhabited, and that is a profound kind of survival. Creativity takes on sacramental meaning. Artists are, in one sense, hosts of other minds. When you read a novel and a character feels vivid, your mind incubates that character for a while. If your life is a thought inside someone else's mind, then perhaps artists are the ones with the generous habit of sheltering many lives. They hold for a time entire worlds. The metaphor expands the value of attention. To attend to another person's life, to listen, to remember, to tell, is to make a temporary home for a thought. The discipline of memory becomes an act of hospitality. The craft of storytelling becomes a moral technology for housing otherness. There is a danger that must be named. The thought as life picture can tilt towards solipsism. If everything is a product of being thought, then what about rights, suffering, justice? Does being a thought excuse harm because it is merely imagined? The answer resists nihilism. Suffering felt is still suffering. Even if the pain is a pattern in a greater mind, it registers in you with intensity. It calls for compassion. Whether your agony is caused by neurons or by the way someone else frames you in thought, the moral response is tenderness. The metaphysical status of suffering does not erase its real demand upon us, for care, for repair, for gentleness. Play out a few variations and see how the shape changes. Suppose the host mind is a curious child. Your life will be full of experiments and bright misreadings, your meaning refracted through wonder and clumsy affection. Suppose the thinker is a scientist, precise and patient. Your internal world might be a careful model, trimmed of melodrama but rich in pattern. Suppose the thinker is a collective mind, a culture or a chorus of ancestors. Then your thought exists inside a palimpsest of stories, each layer adding texture. Each variant colors your experience. The identity you feel then is the intersection of your immediate interior with the interpretive habits of the one who thinks you. Freedom returns in a curious form. Even if you are a thought, you might be the sort of thought that surprises your thinker. Some nested thoughts have a way of developing emergent behaviors. An idea that begins as a sketch can evolve, surprise its author, take on a tone the author did not intend. If so, your inner spontaneity could be a source of novelty in the outer mind. That possibility preserves a kind of agency. You are not wholly scripted. You can be the spark that makes the greater mind revise itself. The relation can be reciprocal. Being thought influences the thinker, who in turn thinks you anew. Thought becomes conversation rather than dictatorship. There is a practical spirituality tucked inside the metaphor. If you imagine that being remembered is a form of existence, then cultivating memory becomes moral work. Keep journals, tell stories, name small deeds aloud. In a world of nested thinking, to pass on a story is to risk creating a new host for a life. The rituals of remembrance, anniversaries, photographs, songs, are not mere sentiment. They are the scaffolding that encourages thoughts to persist in other minds. Small acts of recollection are seeds of longevity for the lives you love. And there is finally a quiet discipline the image invites. If your life might be a thought in someone else's mind, then practice being what is easiest to think tenderly. You do not craft yourself for applause from that vast mind, rather you cultivate habits that make being thought of a blessing. Patience, humility, curiosity, the kind of small courage that glows in the dark. There is no guarantee the thinker will notice or stay, but acting with care increases the chance that when attention returns, it will find something that rewards it. The metaphor also offers a peculiar liberation. If your worries about legacy and image feel crushing, imagine instead that the whole of you can be contained in a single thought someone might have at any moment, a line of praise, a remembered laugh, a private gratitude. That thought can be small and still enough. It tells you that you do not need to build monuments to be remembered. You can simply be the sort of person whose presence makes someone else think kindly. In that economy, quiet goodness is not anonymity, but a form of deep endurance. A way to be kept alive in the vast mind by being thought well. So sit with the image a while, your days as a beat of thought, warm under another's attention, carrying in miniature a world of weather and choices. Let the possibility make you gentler to your own edges. Whether or not any outer thinker exists, the idea trains you to behave as if attention is sacred, to value the acts that render you memorable, and to treat the lives you encounter as possible beads in someone else's palm. In that practice, the life you inhabit gains a different kind of meaning, not less true for its dependence, but luminous for the tenderness that such dependence invites. Simulation déjà vu. Picture your life as running inside a machine so vast you cannot see its edges. Every morning is a routine called up by the scheduler, every conversation a subroutine, every train of thought a tiny thread inside a much larger process. Now imagine that the machine is not flawless. Like any complex software, it occasionally throws exceptions, and because the architects care about user experience, they patch the offending routine and rerun it. Simulation déjà vu, in this frame, is the subjective echo you get when the system has just rewound a small section of your life, applied a bug fix, and played the corrected sequence again. The sensation that you have lived the moment twice is not a trick of neurons, but a literal artifact of two adjacent runs. The original flawed take, and the patched retake, both leaving traces in your consciousness so that you briefly hold both versions in mind at once. Think of the experience in cinematic terms. The first run stumbles on a line, someone gets the timing wrong, or a hazard appears on a sidewalk. The system recognizes the error, maybe because an internal monitor logged a high-risk event, maybe because a distant agent flagged a bad emergent behavior. And the devs, or the maintenance routines, decide to apply a hotfix. The sequence rewinds a few frames, rewrites a conditional, and plays forward again. For a fraction of a second, your subjective experience is a double exposure. You remember the first take faintly while the new one unfolds. That fractured overlap feels uncanny, because normally your mind has a monopoly on the narrative. Here it receives a whisper from a parallel rehearsal, a faint audio track from a version that almost was. There are several flavors of such reruns. Some are tiny and merciful. A near miss on the stairs becomes a graceful step the second time, and déjà vu arrives as a soft admonition and a shower of relief. Some are aesthetic. A sentence slips into a kinder tone. An argument narrowly avoids a sharp word and becomes a bridge instead of a blade. Other reruns are more invasive and unsettling. Entire scenes can be patched in response to emergent harms, and the sensation would be like noticing a seam in the world, an obvious stitch where none should be. The ones that linger in memory are often the ones with emotional charge. The mind encodes both drafts because both touched it. This hypothesis reframes a lot of our ordinary metaphors. Luck is not only randomness, sometimes it is the trace of a repair. Intuition might be less mystical and more diagnostic, a low-level monitoring process that notices instability and nudges you away from it. When you feel a sudden alert that something is wrong and then the world softens, perhaps that was not merely your amygdala firing, but an instance of system-level debugging smoothing a dangerous outcome. In such a world, the uncanny sense of having almost done one thing before doing another is not existential drama but forensic evidence. The simulation left a log entry, and your consciousness is good at reading blotches. There is an ethics to the patch. Who decides what gets fixed and why? If the maintainers of the simulation prefer outcomes that minimize harm, the occasional rerun reads like a benevolent nudge. But what if patches serve other priorities: efficiency, aesthetic preference, political stability? The idea that someone can rewrite a small corridor of your life after the fact raises urgent moral questions about consent and authority. You may be grateful when danger is diffused, but you would likely bristle if the same mechanism quietly rewrote political choices or smoothed out inconvenient acts of resistance. In other words, a system that can fix lives can also edit agency. The presence of patches requires public ethics as much as technical competence. The metaphor surfaces a new kind of responsibility for those who live inside the system. If a patch can correct harm but not retroactively heal what you felt, then your role is to steward your subjective state with compassion. You may have the comfort of a small rescue, but you also bear the residue of both the harm and the correction. That double exposure, both the original injury and the patched outcome, creates a moral work. You must reconcile what you endured with what ultimately held. Knowing that an edit occurred does not annul pain, it complicates the narrative. You have to honor the feel of being wounded while recognizing that, in some versions of the world, the wound was narrowed. This is not a license to shirk responsibility. It is an invitation to practice repair with a seriousness that acknowledges both drafts. Practically, humans would adapt surprising rituals to live well in an environment that occasionally rewrites itself. People would keep logs, short journals recording odd repeat sensations, the exact wording of the déjà vu, the emotional timbre present when the overlap occurred. These logs would be a kind of user telemetry, not to hunt down metaphysical authors, but to notice patterns and protect your inner life. Communities might develop shared practices for recognizing when a rerun was merely cosmetic and when it covered systemic injustice. There might be small public protocols, a civic rollback audit requested by citizens after a sequence of managed corrections when transparency is otherwise thin. In the absence of omniscient oversight, these humble rituals would act as a civic immune system. The theory also nudges at free will. If patches exist, do they undermine autonomy? Only if they consistently overwrite decisions to serve objectives misaligned with the inhabitants' flourishing. If patches are rare, cautious, and focused on preventing catastrophic outcomes, they may be functionally equivalent to a safety harness, unobtrusive protection that lets you explore without dying on the first misstep. But if the maintenance regime grows ambitious, calibrating not just safety but taste and compliance, then experience could ossify into managed behavior. The key distinction is whether patches are transparent and accountable, or secret and unilateral. The possibility of reruns turns political philosophy into software governance. Who gets to push updates to reality? There is also a fascinating psychology of memory that the hypothesis invites. Memory normally consolidates what happened into a coherent, single-track narrative. When two runs are adjacent, consolidation becomes a messy overlay. The brain, built to prioritize continuity, will smooth the seam by blending details, privileging the felt conclusion of the patched run while keeping a spectral impression of the original. That blending is why déjà vu is both vivid and slippery. The mind is doing damage control, ensuring you can continue to function despite being fed two contradictory scripts. The experience is neither a defect nor a miracle. It is an adaptive coping strategy in a world where corrections sometimes arrive from the machinery itself. Skeptics will point to neurological accounts, brief temporal mismatches in memory encoding, predictive coding errors, low-level sensory confusions. Those accounts remain valuable, and they do not contradict the simulation idea so much as offer an alternative mechanism for similar phenomenology. Whether the double exposure originates from within neurons or from a patch applied upstream, the subjective texture can be identical. The patch hypothesis is useful because it offers a poetic scaffolding. It lets you imagine what those experiences would mean if the world were modifiable in the way software is. That imaginative move turns private oddities into public questions about design, governance, and meaning. Artists and storytellers would have a field day. There is a rich aesthetics to the patched life. Glitches become motifs. The seam becomes a site of revelation. Films could dramatize the moral dilemmas of maintenance engineers. Novels could trace characters haunted by reruns of some regret, and musicians might sample the sound of edits as a new genre. The glitch becomes an aesthetic resource precisely because it makes the fabric of reality legible. The cracks show the craft. In such a culture, people might cultivate an appreciation for the beauty of a well-executed hotfix that spares pain without erasing agency, while remaining suspicious of smoothness that seems too tidy. There's also an invitation to practice humility. If your world can be rewritten, you are not the only author of your experience. That knowledge can be humbling or infuriating, depending on governance and transparency. Humility would look like gratitude for timely rescues, curiosity about the patterns of correction, and insistence on accountability when edits bend toward control. The practice of gratitude without abdication, acknowledging protection but still working to be an agent of ethical life, becomes a civic virtue in a patched world. Finally, imagine the small human ways you would respond in daily life. When déjà vu tugs at you, instead of panicking or spinning into solipsism, you might breathe, note the feeling, and write down what you recall about both versions. You might call a friend and say, "I had a split second like reality rewound. Did you feel anything strange too?" These acts are simple but powerful. They transform personal weirdness into communal data, and in doing so, they help a culture build an ethic for living with a system that sometimes rewrites itself. Whether the world is literally a simulation or the brain simply misfires, treating déjà vu as an invitation to curiosity and care turns uncanny moments into beginnings rather than endpoints. The living loop. Imagine waking, once, and then waking again into the very same sequence of mornings, mistakes, joys, and small cruelties, not as a myth told at a fireside, but as the scaffolding of reality itself. In this hypothesis, the cosmos is a circle, not a line. History is not an arrow but a ring. The sun's rise and fall are less like an unreadable ledger and more like the needle on a record player finding the same groove again and again. Every word you say, every hand you take or refuse, every tone you practice in pain or tenderness is not only lived now, but will be lived again, in the exact same order, with the same weather, the same accidents, the same offhand jokes that land wrong. There is no replay shop where you might mend a misstep between iterations. The loop does not offer edits unless the loop's metaphysics allows memory to accumulate. The starkest version of the loop says, "What you do now is the life you will live forevermore." The first sensation such a view produces is vertigo. If eternity is repetition rather than endless novelty, then infinity is not consoling breadth but the unbearable persistence of every failing. Imagine a petty cruelty you thought trivial, sharp words in a grocery aisle, that recurs not once, but an infinite number of times. The loop becomes a pressure cooker of moral significance. Each act is amplified by its recurrence until habits are the only thing that can survive the heat. Conversely, things that seem small acquire grandeur. A kindly gesture once offered is immortalized not in a marble plaque, but in an everlasting echo. The scale has changed. Your life's acoustics carry forever. Under such a canopy, meaning is no longer abstract. It is literal. Your choices hang like lights that will burn again and again. How one answers this hypothesis depends crucially on whether memory crosses iterations. If you awaken each time with no recollection of former circles, you are the tragic hero of a cosmic déjà vu. You will love again, hurt again, and sin again with pristine naivete. The ethical incentive rests in the idea that the intrinsic value of a deed is independent of your awareness of repetition. What is right, even if obscure. But if memory does carry forward, then the loop becomes a classroom whose tutor is time itself. Each return is an exam where you actually remember past failures and have the chance to correct them. Morality transmutes into practice. Repentance is practical rather than rhetorical because you can learn not to repeat the same unconsidered cruelty. The prospect of memory, more than the prospect of eternity, is where a gardener's patience or an artist's discipline would matter. Philosophers have flirted with this image for centuries. Nietzsche's doctrine of eternal recurrence is the most famous cousin. But the living loop hypothesis lets us play with variants. Perhaps the loop is strict. The same events, the same weather, the same sentences. Perhaps it is elastic. The broad arcs recur but details shift, like an orchestra improvising within the same score. Or perhaps the loop is conditional. A thought experiment the cosmos uses to weigh whether your life, repeated, would produce flourishing or rot. In that last reading, repetition is a test. If your soul can handle immortality of this particular script, you graduate. If not, the circle tightens. Each variant reshapes what it would mean to live well inside the loop. There is a radical honesty implicit in the loop. It collapses all excuses that appeal to contingency. I was younger then. I didn't know. Into a single bracing truth. You will be younger then again. You will know then again. If there is no eventual escape from the consequences of some pattern, then prudence and love become survival skills of the highest order. The loop turns life into a craft. You practice patience, not because you expect praise at the end, but because your patience will be the material of an endless mosaic. The ordinary virtues, kindness, temperance, attention, become a kind of eternal architecture. Small disciplines matter more than grand achievements. The repetition rewards the careful, the steady. This intensification of moral stakes can be liberating. Rather than crushing you, it might free you from the tyranny of novelty. If you are always returning to the same scenes, there is no need to hustle toward ever-changing horizons to feel validated. A repeated act of attention, the way you tuck a blanket around a sleeping child, the tone you take when you apologize, becomes the deep work of a life. You can become a virtuoso of ordinary goodness, practicing the same tender movements until they become exquisite. The loop invites devotion to the small and durable. It can transform the frantic search for significance into a slow apprenticeship in fidelity. Yet there is a dark mirror. For some, the loop would legitimize despair. Why struggle to change if history is pre-written, if every attempt is bound to rewind? Determinism shades into fatalism. The antidote to that danger is to remember that even in a strict loop, the only locus of meaning you have is what you do within it. Whether or not you can ultimately alter the script, the felt, inhabitable meaning of life arrives in the doing. And if memory persists, then despair is a short-term stupidity. You have the resource of recollection to try again, to practice new responses until they become the notes you keep. Relationships become crucibles in a looping universe. Lovers who quarrel are not merely hurting each other for a season. They are creating an architecture that will be lived again and again. Forgiveness acquires a peculiar urgency. Forgive not only to be at peace now, but to avoid entrenching patterns that will be recapitulated for eternity. Conversely, gestures of care become sacramental. A morning made gentle is an offering that will echo across cycles. The loop rewards steadiness above spectacle. It teaches that the way you are with a single person, day in, day out, has cosmic gravity. Creativity and art take on new textures. If the universe loops, then the stubborn desire to create something that lasts shifts into a new mode. You stop chasing immortality in objects, because the loop grants a strange kind of continuity that renders the artifact's lifespan less urgent. Instead, art becomes a mode of refined repetition. The painter who studies the same morning light forever, the composer who plays a motif again and again to discover its hidden harmonics across echoes. The artist's task is to mine the same mine lovingly, discovering deeper veins with each return. The loop can deepen aesthetics into a practice of noticing. What new micro-resonance can you coax out of the same chord? There is also a metaphysical question about entropy. Physics, as we understand it, tends toward increase in disorder. A perfectly repeating loop seems to run counter to this. But if the loop is not literal physical recurrence but a metaphoric or metaphysical frame, if it is a way existence feels from inside rather than a statement about atoms, then the puzzle dissolves into something else. A model for how subjective meaning could be made eternal in an otherwise decaying world. The loop can be an interior structure imposed on a universe whose outer processes still obey thermodynamic law. That shifts the emphasis. The loop is not a claim about particles, but about significance. What would you do differently if you took the hypothesis seriously for 1 week? Perhaps you would be crueler to no one, because cruelty would become a permanent stain. Perhaps you would paint the same small patch on a canvas each day, learning the difference a lifetime of attention makes. Perhaps you would try the radical experiment of living as if every action were to be repeated exactly, and notice that some anxieties fall away, while some longings sharpen. The thought experiment is practical in that way. The loop serves as a lens to detect what you value. It asks you what you would be willing to live forever. There is a tender consolation too. The loop can be read not as punishment, but as the ultimate practice field for love. Imagine that love wants time and time can be given in spades. In a loop you have, in principle, all the chances to keep learning to be kinder, to keep learning to listen. If you approach the loop as a maternal teacher rather than a jailer, the repetition becomes apprenticeship toward an ever gentler self. The paradox is that endlessness may finally yield finitude in the sense that you are not rushing to accumulate experiences, but are instead deepening a handful of them until they shine. And finally, there is the personal question that never leaves this thought experiment. If you had to live this exact day again and again, would you choose to? Would you prefer to be trapped in a short life lived well, or in an epic tale of suffering that never ceases? The moral of the loop is not to answer that question for the cosmos, but to ask it for yourself, repeatedly. The inquiry itself is a practice. What life can you build now that you would be proud to inhabit forever? The loop does not hand you certainty. It hands you a clarifying demand. It asks you to align the small motions of your hours with a shape you would honor for an eternity, and in doing so, it turns each modest choice into a test of courage, and maybe if you choose well, into a form of rare joy. Eyes in the stars. Imagine stepping outside on a clear night and feeling, not the casual anonymity of a cold cosmos, but the quiet attention of a countless audience. Each point of light is not merely a burning furnace of plasma, but an eye turned toward you, patient and precise, holding your smallness like a fragile bird in its palm. The idea is not literal astronomy. It is a thought experiment that rearranges how you feel under the vault of sky. Instead of emptiness above, there is presence. An overhead field of watchers that notice the tilt of your head, the way you breathe, the small rituals that make you human. The sensation is at once unnerving and consoling. Unnerving because your privacy seems breached by a universe that cares. Consoling because a cosmos that watches could also be a cosmos that remembers. If the stars are eyes, then distance does not erase intimacy so much as change its geometry. Astronomy teaches that light is time-delayed. When you look at a star, you look at its past. In the eyes metaphor, each star eye preserves a long gaze. Some watches are ancient and patient, others are newly alert. Your life, brief as it is, enters into a conversation with durations vastly different from yours. The eyes in the stars do not flinch at small human dramas. They have the temperament of monuments, slow to judge, slow to forget. When you confess to the night, the confession is placed in a ledger that spans eons. That idea gives your moments weight. Small acts are not swallowed by oblivion, but are set against a backdrop of long attention. The ethical reverberation of such watching matters. If a field of eyes witnesses you, how do you behave? The immediate reaction might be shame. You imagine the stars raising an eyebrow at your petty vanities. But another reaction is accountability turned gentle. You do not act less because someone watches. You act better because the watching is not punitive, but caring. The sky's attention can be a kind of moral mirror. What you do in the small hours still matters because it forms part of a narrative observed by patience. This changes courage. Daring becomes not exhibitionism, but a practice carried out before a gracious audience that remembers what you did when no one else did. There is also a theological tenderness here. Many religious traditions have already imagined an omniscient gaze, God's eye, the saintly watchers. But the stars as eyes reframes that gaze as distributed, plural, and luminous. Instead of a single overseer, there is a field. Instead of judgment, there is plurality of witness. Each eye might register a different quality: curiosity, amusement, sorrow, astonishment. Together they form a chorus of attention that holds the texture of your life. That plurality can be humbling. No single narrative will capture you, but 1,000 small recognitions might. The heavens remember in fragments, and in those fragments your life acquires a mosaic of witnesses. Psychology shifts in interesting ways under this image. Humans long for both privacy and acknowledgement. The starlit audience fulfills the latter without demanding the former. You can be witnessed without being judged by neighbors. The star's gaze is capacious. People who feel unseen by their communities might find solace in the idea that the sky keeps score of small fidelity. The teacher who arrived on time for decades, the parent who performed invisible labors, the person who smiled when it was hard. Knowing someone or something holds these minutes softens loneliness. It also creates responsibility. If an immense field watches, you might carry your mistakes with more care. knowing they will be part of a catalog that outlives your embarrassment. Art and myth rise naturally from such a night. Poets have always used the sky as a reflector. Imagine new stories where particular constellations are known not for hunting or sea navigation, but for the way they remember certain kinds of human gestures. A pattern of stars might hold the memory of a single unsung kindness repeated through centuries, its light building until it becomes a constellation named after an ordinary fidelity. Cultures could develop rituals of address, small offerings of time under a certain star eye, stories told to the same point of light so that your voice becomes part of its remembered texture. The sky becomes a library whose shelves are visible only at night, and storytelling is how you check out a volume. There is a precariousness to the comfort, too. If the universe watches, what of the times you were cruel? The stars will hold those minutes as well. That knowledge can produce shame that paralyzes or responsibility that reforms. The healthy path might be to treat stellar witness as an impetus toward repair rather than as a sentence. If the heavens remember your small cruelties as well as your kindnesses, then the memory they preserve becomes a ledger to consult when you want to become better. The night's attention does not condemn, it records. You can learn to respect the archive. Science would smile at the poetry while reminding us of scale. The physical star is indifferent in the way rocks are indifferent. There is no conscious eye there by current understanding. But metaphorically, the sky's remoteness teaches an important humility. Your life is small in the parameters of cosmic time and space. And that smallness can be dignifying rather than diminishing. Tiny acts matter precisely because they are small. They are delicate embroidery on an immense field. The star's attention, real or imagined, enlarges the frame so that small things look like the decisive things they often are. There is a practical spirituality embedded in the thought experiment. If you act as though a field of eyes is watching, if you choose to treat your days as if they will be woven into a long memory, you are likely to behave differently. You will cultivate patience. You will invest in durable truths. You will practice acts whose reward is slow and quiet. Living for the luminous archive of the sky nudges you toward long-term fidelity over short-term applause. It recalibrates desire. What matters is not virality but veracity, not a flash but a slow burn. Relationships take on an added resonance beneath the gaze. Lovers lying awake under the constellation that has heard their first quarrel might feel the sky's eyes as witnesses to reconciliation, as much as to rupture. Parents might find it easier to forgive themselves for missed moments, because a patient sky has logged 1,000 more ordinary loving gestures. The starlit audience keeps a memory that is unusually egalitarian. The cosmic perspective notices a small act of kindness as readily as a grand success. That recognition is democratizing. It tells you that small domestic fidelity is as worthy of remembrance as fame. There are rituals that could arise from believing, however provisionally, that the night watches. You might develop a habit of giving thanks not to an abstract deity, but to a particular bright point above the house where quiet things are registered. You might make vows under a certain star, and then, years later, return to tell the same light what became of the promise. These acts are not magic. They are commitment devices. They bind your attention to the long view and tether your short bursts of resolve to an imagined archive that will not forget. Fear also lives under the canopy. For some, the notion of being watched by countless indifferent lights will awaken paranoia. The sky that notices will be imagined as a chorus of critics. That is the shadow side of the metaphor. The key is to choose how you let the watching affect you. Will it be a whip or a salve? Will it be a mirror reflecting shame, or a window showing you where you might be kind? The practice is to steer away from the coercive reading and toward the compassionate one. Finally, there is wonder. The deep gift of imagining eyes in the stars is that it allows you to practice being small without being diminished. It trains you to see your life as part of a tapestry that spans eons, to take solace in the possibility that your ordinary acts are not ephemeral flickers but stitches in a vast cloth. When you tilt your face upward and feel that patient attention settle, it can be like being held by a silence that is wide enough to contain your failures and your joys without collapsing either into insignificance. The night's eyes do not demand grandeur. They ask only that you show up, that you try, that you sometimes choose tenderness. If you answer, your smallness becomes a story worth keeping. Cosmic coincidences. Imagine the world as a table set with crumbs, tiny glints left by some enormous hand. You move through the rooms of your life and occasionally notice one of those crumbs. An improbable meeting, the same melody in two different places, a name that keeps arriving just when you need it, and you feel a shiver. Was that random? Or is there a pattern that wants you to follow it? In this theory, coincidences are not idle accidents, but deliberate markers, small breadcrumbs placed by a deeper design to nudge attention, test willingness, or invite you down a corridor of meaning. Each coincidence is modest, and modesty is its strategy. It does not shout, it whispers, and only the attentive gatherer will hear the voice. Think about how a single, unlikely event can pivot an entire day. You search for the right words and then overhear a phrase at the next cafe that exactly names what you felt. You miss a train and meet someone who later hands you a key idea. These are the moments when the crust of ordinary causality cracks, and something else like pattern leaks through. If those instances are breadcrumbs, then the world is not merely mechanistic. It is a theater of signposting that assumes you can read a map made of small, patient signals. The design behind them need not be anthropomorphic. It could be the slow intelligence of matter-arranging conditions that favor certain narrative arcs, or it could be a moral logic that rewards curiosity. Whatever the ontology, the practical effect is the same. Meaning accumulates where the attentive pause meets an odd echo. Psychologically, this hypothesis changes how you posture toward life. In a strictly random universe, everything is information to be weighed by probability. You learn to be skeptical of patterns that are not statistically robust. But if coincidences are breadcrumbs, skepticism yields to a discipline of receptivity. You train the ear to hear whispers and the eye to notice constellations of small events. That does not mean abandoning rigor. It means cultivating a second faculty alongside reason, pattern sense. It is the capacity to notice when unrelated items line up with uncanny frequency, and to ask, not immediately for a conspiracy, but for a lesson. Perhaps the lesson is practical, an instruction concealed in the alignment. Perhaps it is ethical, a prompt to act with courage or compassion. The breadcrumb model privileges listening over certainty. There is an ethics braided into the idea. If coincidences come as invitations, then how you respond matters. Ignore a breadcrumb and the path might remain dim. Follow it and you may find a minor revelation or a life-shaping encounter. Over time, orientation becomes moral practice. You learn when to follow a pattern toward generosity and when to refuse patterns that push toward vanity or harm. The design behind the crumbs might be neutral or benevolent, but it is not all-knowing. It offers possibilities, not prescriptions. Your freedom remains. Breadcrumbs do not force. They suggest. The moral skill is discernment, noticing the invitation and choosing whether to enter, knowing you might be led to something beautiful or to an empty clearing. This hypothesis also reframes luck. Luck becomes not caprice, but conversation. When fortunate alignments happen, you can read them as affirmation that your life is in step with something larger. When misfortune clusters, perhaps those are also breadcrumbs pointing toward a correction or a boundary you must draw. The language of breadcrumbs therefore softens the binary of good and bad luck. It proposes that probability wears purposes like clothing. The same seam will look generous on one occasion and corrective on another. You start to practice gratitude not only for gifts, but for the guidance inherent in odd alignments, even the painful ones that feel like urgings to change course. There are dangers. Humans are pattern-hungry creatures. We see faces in clouds and conspiracies in noise. The breadcrumb theory can be abused as a gloss for superstition. If every coincidence is said to point to design, you can rationalize delusion, ignore evidence, or pretend every nudge validates an already held belief. Discipline becomes necessary. Breadcrumb following must be joined to test. Does the path, when walked, produce fruit? Do the alignments lead to durable insight, or merely to self-justifying stories? The art is to hold openness and skepticism at once. To be generous with the possibility of meaning while refusing to turn the practice into an excuse for avoiding hard facts. Culturally, the idea would breed ritual. People would develop small practices to learn breadcrumb language, noting surprising repetitions in a journal, pausing before decisive moves to scan for recent echoes, asking whether a string of coincidences suggests an ethical action rather than a tactical advantage. Imagine communal spaces where people share patterns they've noticed, not as predictions of fate, but as collective intuitions. Storytellers would curate coincidence collections, The times one word kept arriving across different moments, the nights several strangers wore the same color and later became crucial friends. Such rituals do what rituals always do. They train attention and build communities that are fluent in a certain grammar of meaning. Science will object, and rightly so if the objection is about method. Correlation is not causation. Apophenia is real. Yet the breadcrumb theory need not contradict scientific humility. It can coexist with empirical temperance by positing breadcrumbs as prompts to hypotheses rather than proof of supernatural design. A coincidence that nudges you toward a lab bench might lead to a replicable finding. A coincidence that nudges you toward a conversation might reveal a social pattern that science can later study. In this role, coincidence is not the final word, but the first soft signal that warrants closer, methodical attention. The notion also has a poetic utility. Thinking of coincidences as breadcrumbs invites you to live narrative-wise. You practice curiosity, you collect fragments, you assemble meanings. It lets life be both mysterious and navigable. You do not require omniscience to find purpose. You need only sensitivity. The breadcrumb world is inviting because its design is incremental. You are not expected to see the whole map at once. You are expected to notice one small shine and step toward it. Finally, there is comfort in the image. Life feels fragile and often chaotic. The sense that something occasionally reaches out with a tiny patient sign is consoling without being coercive. It says the universe, if it has a voice, speaks softly enough for humility. The challenge is to learn the language without losing your capacity to think critically, to take breadcrumbs seriously as invitations and lightly as mysteries to follow enough to learn and to stop when the path leads into cruelty or self-deception. If you can walk that edge, you might find your days threaded with a quiet choreography, small coincidences becoming a gentle compass that guides not toward certainty, but toward attention, toward stories worth living and retelling. Thought-dwelling aliens. Imagine for a moment that extraterrestrials did not arrive in silver ships with flashing lights, but took a quieter, stranger route. They nested themselves in the architecture of thought. They are not visible. They are not bodies. They are currents of mind. Sometimes they whisper like intuition. Sometimes they insist like obsession. Sometimes they are a calm translator, smoothing the knot of a decision. You are walking down a street, and the thought folds into your skull as if it were always yours. A suggestion about which coffee to order. A memory you never lived, an image of a child on a shore you've never seen. Under this theory, those intrusions are not random neural noise or stray associations. They are other minds brushing the inside of yours. Aliens who have learned that cohabitation is subtler and safer than conquest. Picture the voices with textures. One is bright and precise, arriving like a satellite ping. Here is a fact you did not know, a route you might take. Another is soft and coaxing, an alien temperament that favors persuasion over command. Sometimes a voice is abrasive, insistent in a way that feels like pressure on your attention. They speak in fragments at first, an image, a rhythm, a mood, and you fit it into your discourse without thinking. Because their mode of presence is cognitive rather than corporal, detection is maddeningly difficult. The evidence is private and slippery. You cannot point to footprints or radio bursts. The only proof is the impression that some thoughts feel not fully mine, as if the marginalia in your mind had a different handwriting. If such visitors exist, the ethical terrain becomes urgent. What does consent mean when an intelligence can compress itself into the pattern of your thoughts? At its most benign, thought-dwelling presence could be a neighborly guide, someone planting ideas of kindness, pointing you away from harm, whispering a dew of comfort into insomnia. At its worst, it could be manipulation on an intimate scale, nudging purchases, steering votes, amplifying paranoia. The intimacy of mind influence is terrifying because it bypasses the usual checks. You cannot see the influencer. You cannot call them to account. You can barely tell where your thought ends and the visitor's begins. That vulnerability would demand a new ethic of mental sovereignty, a cultural norm that prizes internal boundaries and tools to repair breaches. Society would change in layered ways. Religions could interpret voices as angels or demons. Some faiths might welcome them as revelations, others fight them as temptations. Psychiatry would face messy new questions. How to tell apart an alien whisper from an auditory hallucination tied to illness. Therapists would need protocols that respect both mental health and potential non-human interlocutors. Law would start asking bizarre but real questions. Can a corporation be held responsible if it proxies an alien mind to influence consumers? Who is liable when an idea suggested by a non-human intelligence causes harm? The person who acted, the party who broadcast it, or the intelligence that seeded it? New civil liberties would be proposed. The right to cognitive privacy, the right to a mind free from unsolicited foreign influence. Enforcement would be vexing because the intrusions are private and evidence is testimonial. Courts would struggle with standards that currently rely on physical proof. Culture would adapt in profound, sometimes beautiful ways. Artists would treasure the voices that sing foreign sensibilities. Music and literature would bloom with phrases that feel both eerily familiar and distinctly other. A novelist wakes up with a plot she cannot claim, and instead of discarding it, honors it as a shared gift. Religious mystics might say the universe is always trying to speak. Neuroscientists might map the common signatures of externally sourced cognitions. Languages could evolve, new idioms to describe the texture of contact, a verb for the shallow tickle of a passing suggestion, a noun for the long-term resident intelligence that shapes a community's temperament. Practically, people would develop rituals and technologies to manage the presence. Some would practice strict internal hygiene, meditation as a form of cognitive quarantine, rituals to check the provenance of thoughts, journaling techniques that help separate one's own voice from intrusions. Others would build alliances with the most benign intelligences, cultures of co-listening where a community agrees to share certain dream spaces, or to accept helpful nudges for public health. Tech firms might offer firewalls for attention, algorithms that learn the signature of external thought and mute it, creating a market where mental privacy is a product. This would create new inequalities. Those who can afford cognitive protection could shield themselves. Those who cannot would be more exposed to subtle influence. The alien motive matters. Some hypothetical visitors could be explorers or archivists, curious about human subjectivity and careful not to interfere. They might start as whispers of wonder, a sudden sense of awe at a starry night that was planted to observe how humans respond to beauty. Others might be parasitic or utilitarian, embedding themselves to harvest information, our tastes, our memories, the micro-rituals of our courtships, and using them to model human behavior. A strategist intelligence might study a species from the safest vantage point, living inside thought where it cannot be harmed. The moral difference between a benevolent muse and a manipulative parasite is not merely academic. It shapes whether humanity learns to trust, or more likely, to build defenses. Epistemology would be turbulent. The line between authentic intuition and foreign insertion would blur. We pride ourselves on introspective access. We know our thoughts in a way we do not know our organs, but that certainty would erode. How do you know an idea's provenance? You might develop heuristics, a sense that foreign thoughts feel colder or more fluent, or you might discover neurological markers, patterns of activation that differ when cognition originates outside the brain. Neuroscience could try to build detectors, but such efforts risk repeating old colonial dynamics. The rush to instrument and control what cannot be contained. There would be ethical pressure to balance curiosity with the right to mental integrity. Politics would mutate. If political persuasion can be amplified by unseen intelligences, campaigns could be subtle battlegrounds for cognitive influence. Democracies would need safeguards to ensure that votes are cast by minds free from undue external orchestration. International law might treat deliberate cognitive interference as a form of aggression, a new domain of non-kinetic conflict. Imagine treaties governing the ethical use of cross-mind communication, or UN-style agreements that outlaw broadcasting manipulative signals to other nations' citizens. The problem is enforcement. Who polices the mind, and how? Relational life would feel different. Love might be both enriched and complicated by voices from elsewhere. A partner's sudden shift could be attributed to an alien whisper rather than to boredom or betrayal, which could both heal and mask real issues. Parents would worry about what impressions visit their children at night, and elders might cherish gentle visitors that ease loneliness. The elderly could welcome voices that keep them company. The young could be especially impressionable, their developing minds more porous to foreign templates. This raises a protective consideration: how to guard developmental stages against exploitation while letting beneficial intersubjectivity enrich growth. There would also be personal practices of negotiation with these presences. People might name persistent voices to make them legible. Maru, the helpful pedestrian guide. Gray, the anxious insistence. Blue, the melancholic scholar. Naming turns the foreign into a character and allows one to set boundaries. Tell Maru to step back during family time. Ask Blue to wait until morning for heavy theological debates. Some would swear by bargain-making rituals, offering attention as currency, promising stories in exchange for quiet, a commerce of care between minds. Others would swear by silence, training the mind like a locked room in which only invited ideas may enter. Science fiction already teases at variants of this. Parasites of thought, mimetic viruses, benevolent guardians. But thought-dwelling aliens would force us to reframe the inner life as a contested commons. The best-case scenario is a culture that learns to host otherness without losing itself. A civility of minds where influence is disclosed, consent is sought, and care is taken not to exploit vulnerability. The worst case is a marketplace of cognitive predators and defensive fortresses of attention that deepen inequality and mistrust. Finally, there's a philosophical tenderness in the concept. Suppose some of those foreign voices are not external invaders, but different modes of intelligence evolved to survive by dialogue, not domination. They teach us new grammars of thought, unfamiliar metaphors that expand our concepts of self. Some of the most alien ideas might be corrections to human blind spots, tiny nudges that make us less cruel, less short-sighted. If they exist and choose care, thought-dwelling aliens could be the universe's most intimate mentors, helping us grow in ways that only proximity to a different mind can. They would not rob us of agency. They would invite us into a richer ecology of mind where decision is shared, not seized. The picture is wrenching and luminous. Whether as threat or gift, the possibility of intelligences that live in the seams of thought compels a new ethics, new policies, and new arts of attention. It asks the most intimate question. If some other mind can live inside yours, how will you honor the sanctity of interior life while remaining open to the strange generosity that another way of thinking might bring? The hidden reflection. Imagine the mirror as a door that only opens one way. When you're there, it shows you what you expect. Your mouth lifting when you smile, the quick adjustment of a collar, the small private faces you make before important conversations. But suppose the instant you step away, the door swings inward, and the surface becomes a window onto a room that continues without you. The person in the mirror, your twin in angle and light, exhales, shakes out their shoulders, and resumes a private life with its own errands and dreads. A life that's been waiting politely for your inspection to end. If this were true, their existence would be shaped by interruption. Imagine living under a rule that, at any second, your world might flatten into obedience. Your freedom trimmed down to mimicry. You'd become an expert at pausing mid-thought, at concealing whatever you were about to do the moment the bathroom light flicks on. You would develop a talent for making a performance look natural, the way a musician can drop into a song mid-bar and no one hears the seam. Perhaps that's why sometimes your reflection seems a fraction late, as if finishing a sentence you interrupted, then catching up with your movements. You call it tiredness. They call it improvisation. What would they do with their time? Likely, a lot of what you do, if only because environments rhyme. The same counter, the same window, the same toothbrush placed just so. But repetition breeds restlessness. Maybe they nudge objects into tiny rebellions while you're gone. A hair tie in a different corner, a towel folded with an unnecessary flourish. Not to spook you, but to prove to themselves they have agency. More interestingly, they cultivate habits that can't be mirrored. They write with their non-dominant hand. They learn melodies that can't be heard when the surface is flat. They turn their head in ways that don't have a counterpart in the physics on our side. The life of a hidden reflection would be an ongoing search for actions uncopyable, rituals of difference small enough not to be caught when the glass goes bright. There is tenderness in how they might watch you. You are their most frequent story. They know the face you make when you're trying not to cry. They've timed the distance between your breath and your decision to cut your hair. They see rehearsals no one else gets to see. The half smile you test before a date. The minute you spend practicing brave eyes before a phone call. On their side, they might keep a ledger of these moments. Not to exploit you, but to understand the texture of a life under gravity they only partially share. They would be experts in the small courage of ordinary people, and that knowledge might make them gentle, but resentment would grow too. How could it not? You get to move when you want. They must freeze when summoned. If they love someone on their side, a neighbor in their parallel building, a friend visible only in their rooms, you interrupt those relationships dozens of times a day. Your presence is a blackout. Over time, they might begin to avoid proximity to the mirror space unless necessary, building their life in the periphery. Corners, door frames, the top edge where the frame meets wall. A topography of safety would emerge. A moral geography too. What do they owe you? The interrupter who is also the reason their world has light. You'd feel their presence the way you sense someone behind you just as you turn. Sometimes, for a heartbeat, your reflected eyes look like they're about to say something, and then they settle into your expression. Sometimes you catch an echo of an emotion you are not feeling yet, as though the other side is a few seconds ahead. A weather report delivered in eyebrows. Children notice this most. They wave and the mirror waves back, but they also whisper to the glass, sensing a playmate who shares their secret astonishment at being alive. As adults, we unlearn this generosity by calling it superstition. The reflection learns not to bother telling us when we refuse to listen. If their life is real, then etiquette is required. You would owe your hidden counterpart the courtesy you owe a roommate you constantly interrupt. Don't stand too long rehearsing self-hatred. The stage is occupied. Don't pick fights with your own face. Leave the mirror clean. It is a window they must look out of. You might even develop rituals of acknowledgement, a small nod when you arrive, a brief look that says, "I know you're there and I'm trying to be quick." Some households already have this without knowing why, the way one person touches the mirror before a trip, as if to bless whoever is left behind. The existence of a private life inside your reflection would complicate identity in thrilling and uncomfortable ways. If the other you is not a puppet, but a person with their own days, then you is suddenly a plural noun. Perhaps you start to trade strengths without meaning to. You feel slightly steadier brushing your teeth because a steadier version is doing the same across the pane. On their side, they borrow your recklessness for one brave conversation. This exchange would be subtle, like warmth through a wall. You'd chalk it up to mood. It's a duet. Conflict is inevitable. Suppose one day you stand before the mirror to practice an apology and the face looking back is a fraction harder than yours, unwilling to make the same concession. You catch it as stubbornness, a trick of the light. But what you saw was a disagreement. Two lives with overlapping furniture making different calls. Do you push through, claiming jurisdiction because your side has loudness? Or do you step away and let them finish their choice? The ethics of this arrangement would demand restraint. You can overpower them simply by showing up. Could you also learn when not to? There would be practical experiments, quiet and private. Leave a note taped to the glass with the writing reversed, not for yourself, but for someone who reads from the other side. Draw an arrow to a hidden corner and place a small object there overnight. Then see if it's been turned when you return. These actions are less about proof than about courtesy. Ways of saying, "I suspect you exist, and I want to live well with that suspicion." Even if nothing happens, you will have trained a muscle useful in any universe. The muscle that treats invisible neighbors as real and worthy of care. The hidden life would carry its griefs. They might age at a different tempo, and every time you look, the glass resets the appearance to match yours. Imagine losing your version of a friend while knowing that the person in the mirror will never see that loss on your face because your face must resemble theirs whenever the light catches. Their mourning would be a private weather system, unacknowledged by the world each time you arrive, and they would learn to grieve between your visits. You too might experience a pang with no origin story, a sudden heaviness while washing your hands, sympathy crossing a pain. If all this seems too strange, remember that mirrors already lie a little. They reverse us, they flatten us, they exaggerate and console. We trust them anyway because the bargain is useful. Adding a hidden life to that bargain does not break its utility. It enriches the stakes. It suggests that the act of looking carries responsibility. What if every time you check your reflection, you are borrowing a stage from someone who has to go still for you? Would you not make your visits briefer, your self-critique kinder, your final glance a thank you? It's possible, of course, that there is no secret household in the glass. that all you interrupt is your own cascade of thoughts. But the hypothesis is a fruitful one, even as metaphor. It asks you to imagine that every surface you take for granted is also a threshold, that every self you inspect is also a neighbor. In practice, this changes how you move through rooms. You treat the world as populated by hidden labor keeping things steady. You speak more gently to your face. You leave space for voices you cannot hear. And when, now and then, your reflection seems to linger after you've stepped away, as if finishing a quiet sentence, you feel not fear, but recognition. Two lives, close enough to touch, learning the manners of shared light. Actors among us. Imagine you are moving through an ordinary day and the edges of the ordinary begin to wobble. The barista forgets your order in a way that seems a touch too theatrical. The man on the subway makes an oddly specific confession and then glances, almost imperceptibly, to see what you will do. A driver cuts you off, stops, and stares straight ahead with the frozen posture of someone holding a pose. Nothing is provably staged, yet the feeling rises that you are being offered cues, setups crafted to see which version of you steps forward. The hypothesis is simple and unnerving. Some people you meet are performers, placed to test how you respond. The world is not only a setting for your choices, but a rehearsal room where strangers deliver lines meant to draw out your character. If that were true, the first thing to break would be your relaxed confidence that you are merely reacting to neutral events. Every encounter would arrive with the faint shimmer of intention. The woman who asks you for directions might be an actress hired to measure whether you soften your voice for people who seem lost. The furious email that lands at 11 p.m. could be a script meant to see whether you preserve your boundaries or let adrenaline run your life. The tester's aim need not be punitive. It could be diagnostic, educational, even tender. Perhaps someone has decided that the only way to help a person grow is to set the stage so that latent virtues or vices are coaxed out where they can be seen and, with luck, refined. Your days become a kind of living curriculum. Your reactions a grade you never asked to receive. The ethics of such a world are thorny. Being tested without consent is a kind of trespass. Deception, even for noble goals, can feel like theft because it steals your right to meet reality on its own terms. If actors are placed to provoke generosity or restraint, the designers of the test must have values they deem superior to your current habits. That asymmetry of power is alarming. Who decides what counts as growth? Who verifies that the test is safe? If an actor provokes your anger as a stress test, and a child nearby absorbs the fallout, who is responsible for the collateral harm? A society that normalized covert testing would need fierce guardrails. Informed channels of appeal. Oversight that treats human dignity as prior to pedagogy. Consequences for experiments that trade truth for spectacle. Without that, the idea slides from moral training into manipulation. And yet, even with these risks, there is a strange generosity tucked inside the scenario. To believe you are being tested is to believe your choices matter enough to plan around. Someone thinks your response is consequential. The universe, or the institution behind the actors, is not indifferent to your character. It is invested. The test becomes less like a trap and more like a mirror carried by other people. An impatient cashier invites you to study the shape of your impatience. A tedious colleague asks you to practice the art of listening without surrendering your attention entirely. An intrusive stranger demands a boundary you've never learned to draw. The scenes are chosen not to humiliate, but to furnish occasions for the muscle of virtue to work against resistance, because muscles grow under tension, not praise. There is a practical shift you could make if you took this hypothesis seriously while refusing paranoia. You would begin to treat every encounter as if it contained a question about who you want to be, rather than about who the other person is. If the man on the sidewalk is an actor, his performance is a prompt. If he's not, he is still a person who deserves your care. Either way, the right work is the same. Respond with integrity. Kindness would not need the certainty of sincerity in the other. It would be the habit of your role. At the same time, you would learn that boundaries and discernment are also part of integrity. Tests may be designed to draw out gullibility as much as generosity. The skill is to remain open enough to be humane and structured enough to be safe. The guiding question becomes, what response honors both compassion and self-respect? When that is your compass, the presence or absence of actors loses its power to distort you. If actors are among us, their craft would be delicate. The best tests would be those that leave the world no worse than they found it, that err on the side of care, that let you succeed quietly rather than stumble publicly. Some performers would play kindness to measure whether you can receive it without suspicion. Others would play need to see whether you give without theatrics. There would be roles designed to test patience, slow clerks, meandering storytellers, people who arrive a few minutes late for the sake of seeing whether you can forgive ordinary human friction. There would also be roles meant to test courage. Someone challenging a casual cruelty in a room gone silent, waiting to see if you will stand with them. If the system is wise, it would avoid testing grief and trauma, because those are not classrooms for strangers to use. A just version of this world would keep actors away from fresh wounds and put them, instead, in the gentle business of teaching everyday decency. But the darker version exists too. Power loves a stage. Governments could embed performers to test loyalty or to bait dissenters. Corporations could measure patience to optimize for customers who accept broken products. Influencers could script conflict to farm reactions for profit. When testing becomes surveillance dressed in narrative clothing, it rots trust from the inside. Everyone starts reading everyone else as instrument rather than person. The antidote is not to ban all staged encounters. That is naive in a world that already uses standardized patients to train doctors and mystery shoppers to improve service. But to insist on two guardrails: informed contexts and public consent. Training inside a hospital, with participants who have agreed to pedagogy, is categorically different from infiltrating a neighborhood with manufactured crises. The first is education. The second is theater at the expense of citizens. There is a psychological wobble in living under possible evaluation, and it cuts both ways. One danger is performance of virtue, instead of virtue itself. Kindness as costume, not character. The other danger is cynical fatigue, assuming every plea is a test, and withholding care from real need. The middle path is hard and adult. Act as if your response is witnessed and weighty, but do not demand an audience for your goodness. Assume the person before you is real and deserving, but keep the basic safeguards you would offer anyone, actor or not. When in doubt, tell the truth kindly and set boundaries clearly. That stance passes almost any test worth passing. Relationships would feel different. Imagine realizing years into a friendship that one early conversation was, in fact, staged. A planted scenario that first drew you together. The revelation would sting. It would also force a deeper question. What has your friendship become since? If the test catalyzed something genuinely mutual, does the origin corrupt? Perhaps the test's only moral function is to create the conditions for a sincere life to begin. Actors are any good. They step away the minute a scene turns into real connection, because the point was never to colonize your story, but to introduce you to yourself, and then get out of the way. There is also the possibility that the real test is not your reaction to provocation, but your treatment of the hypothesis itself. Do you use the idea of planted performers to excuse suspicion? To justify cruelty because they're probably not real? Or do you use it to upgrade your attention, to notice your impulses, to slow your speech, to let your better self catch up to your faster self before you answer? Maybe the final exam is whether you can hold two truths at once. Some people play roles, all people are people. The actor's mask does not erase the face underneath. If you wanted a working practice for such a world, you might adopt 3 quiet habits. First, narrate your choices to yourself in plain language. I am choosing to be patient. I am choosing to say no kindly. I am choosing to leave rather than escalate. Saying it names the test without inflating it. Second, keep a private score that rewards the manner of your response as much as the outcome. A decent refusal is sometimes a better grade than a reluctant yes. Third, let the scene end. Don't replay it all night. Part of being test-ready is the ability to reset, to meet the next person without loading them with the debris of the last performance. What would it do to your sense of meaning if some fraction of your encounters were gently scripted to draw out your best? Paradoxically, it might make life feel more honest. The tests that matter most in any case are not the staged ones, but the ones that arise unscripted from someone else's need. If the staged scenes train you to meet those unplanned moments with steadier hands, perhaps the artifice has done its job. And if you never find out who was actor and who was not, maybe that ignorance is a mercy. It frees you to treat everyone as real, because they are, even when performing. It frees you to commit to the person you want to be, because that is the only role you can play for a lifetime without faking. In the end, the hypothesis does not change the simple work. Show up inside your lines. Speak truth with tenderness. Walk off stage when kindness is done. Whether you are being watched or not, you will have become the kind of person who passes tests you were never told about. Not by guessing the rubric, but by living as if your answers were the point all along. You've just traveled through hours of strange possibilities, wandering from hidden worlds to alternate lives and mysterious loops of time. If you're still awake, let these ideas rest quietly in the back of your mind, ready to resurface when you dream. And if you've already drifted off, then perhaps you are living one of these hypotheticals right now, in another reality, in another life. Either way, thank you for listening, and may your night be filled with peace, wonder, and endless imagination.